And you could say there were certain things in my life, though, that I observed and experienced as a child that didn't make a lot of sense to me. And I guess as the years sort of rolled on and more sort of stuff happened in the normal sort of sense of just being in a constant dysfunctional family where everyone's sort of yelling at each other and not getting on, and timings of things going wrong and all sorts of weird sort of stuff. But, you know what family doesn't, kind of have that sort of experience at some sort of stage anyway, whether it be in a constant sense or a periodical sense from time to time. And I got to the point where, I don't know, I always questioned everything from a very, very young age. And one thing that I always carried with me that I was very aware as a child, even though I didn't have the language communication skills as a child to speak like an adult, say like as I can now. The same goes for anyone really. But I observed things and realised things and recognised things, and I used to ask questions, and I'd always be left with the impression that most adults would just, put on a bit of a front to you, like they go, oh, look at the little kid and this, that and the other and blah, blah, blah. And they think children don't see through and understand what adults are up to. Wrong. And I had a memory like an elephant for anything significant, anything of the unusual, anything that didn't make sense, anything that didn't add up. And when parents gave me sort of lame excuses for certain things, like quite often as a parent, you've got to tell children certain things. You don't want to tell them lies, but, you want to be able to tell them the truth, but in a way when they're emotionally sort of prepared and ready for certain things, depending on the nature of what those things are. So with me saying that, at the same time, I do understand the other side of the equation when you're trying to be a responsible, caring parent. But the thing was, this extended beyond parents, and I found a lot of adults used to lie, and I used to see through it all. And most of the time, I wouldn't want to head too sort of much into heavy confrontation, especially, if I sensed that it was going to put me in, in sort of danger of harm, or, physical sort of, duress. And I had parents and a father that were particularly strict. They were good people. They had good intentions from what I could see. But they, like a lot of people, that pre-baby boomer generation, they were very programmed. They sort of believed in the establishment and what they were told and history and all the rest of it, and they kind of tend to toe the line in that sort of sense. But I guess the more life went on, the more I questioned things. I remember getting to the age of 18, and I remember in the backyard of my parents' house one day, I have a very vivid memory looking at this old persimmon tree. And I used to think to myself, or really deeply sense, this whole reality is someone's really bad joke, a really sick bad joke. Now, I know that's not a particularly healthy sort of attitude to have or think of, but this is how I honestly felt and what I'd experienced and how I could see through things. And yet I wouldn't always know how to communicate it or even how to describe what I was sensing and seeing and what I picked up on. And I didn't really have any other people sort of similar sort of minded or similar type of people like myself to sort of validate the type of person that I was. And so that was difficult because I was very intuitive. And yet I grew up in an environment where it was all very you could say, normal in a sense of just like established sort of views, of what everyone toes a line with in society. And I used to get into all sorts of trouble as a child. It wasn't because I deliberately wanted to run amok or create trouble. I just often found myself in a lot of controversial situations because I was just I just had a pure intent of just following my nose. And when things didn't make sense, or you had authorities just basically telling you to obey orders, my father was very strict. He told me to just basically obey orders as he'd been brought up. He was an Englishman, was born in Welwyn Garden City. It's on the outskirts of London there, and he'd been brought up during the war when it was sort of, ration time, and there was much hardship, and he was brought up like the typical strict English upbringing sort of thing, as a child is to be seen and not heard sort of thing. And so that kind of got a bit passed on to me, and I wasn't allowed to ever answer back or argue in that certain way. And there was a bit of a fear that was sort of bred into me of authority from my dad in that sort of sense, because he'd just end up belting me if I took the point too far with him. And regardless of whether I was wrong or right, it was always a matter of don't argue back. So it wasn't a very good emotional validation sort of thing. So I tended to pretty much just disconnect and just operate in my own independent shell. You could say that, I kind of found my own centre, in the sense of I found a place within inside me that was me, that no matter how bad things got, that was a place that was me, and no one could take that from me, and that was the end of that. So I'm trying to, I guess, explain things in a reasonably brief way before we get into the more crazy sort of stuff. And I'll start. So yeah, I went to an elite private school from 1977. I'd been at a public school before that. My parents took me out of. They felt it didn't work for me. I went to a private school before that as well when I started school, and that didn't work for me either. And yet I remained at this particular elite private school, to the end of my sort of high school matriculation. And the whole time, really, I just wished my parents sent me to a normal state school, what's called a public school, which I think in England is the opposite. They call a state government school a private school over there, don't they?
They do, yeah. And
yeah.
The average school's called it like a comprehensive. That's where I went to. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So it's kind of, the terminology is sort of opposite here, but at the end of the day, it's either a state government sort of school which kids go to for free, or the parents pay big dollars and send them to the private schools. Some of them some are more richer than others, depending on the clientele, etc., etc. Now, I went to one of these schools, and I was in the same form as some very rich people running the country now. Like, say, for instance, I was in the same class as James Packer. Okay? Same form. And then you had Fairfaxes, and look, there was all sorts of people. Just to give you an idea of the type of school I was at. And I think, as I said before, by a certain stage in high school, I just wanted my parents just to send me to a normal state school, because being cooped up in a school that's an all-boys school, it's not a healthy thing to do to your child, I tell you. The same with sending your girl to an all-girls school. It's not natural. You kind of got to grow up with the opposite sex so you can get to know them. Because when it comes to emotional intelligence and dealing with the other sex, I have to say most private school people, unless they've got really, really cool parents that can sort of balance them out and sort of give them a home experience that sort of, tells them, that enables them to be sort of more adjusted person growing up with the other opposite sex, well, pretty much turns people into retards.
Hello, Goz. You've disappeared. Are you still there?
Now, yes, I am.
Yeah.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me, Alan?
Yes, I can hear you. Okay. Carry on.
Okay. Now, a lot of strange stuff did happen, though, in my early childhood, in particular between the years of when I was 4 till 7. And that were the years 1972 to 1975, 1976, actually up to 4 to just, not long before my 8th birthday. And I'd always had this one lingering memory. I'd had quite a few lingering memories, but one in particular where I'd always be hanging around in the back gardens where there was many in a suburb of Sydney on the lower North Shore called Mossman. And my mum was always sort of talking with professors and scientists and in this particular house. And all through my life, I'd always have a recall back to being in this garden. And I'd always remember it. And I'd think to myself, why am I always remembering this? Why am I always remembering this? And it's something that would come and go, like a lot of other sort of strange memories of certain times with my parents or my mother, just alone in particular, when she'd basically take me as a young infant, to her workplaces and being a mother, just taking me wherever she's going, as mothers do, with their kids. But I do have a younger brother, but the thing was that she used to take me to this mansion all the time and never took my brother once. So I thought that was a little bit odd because I was going to daycare and kindergarten, all that sort of stuff as a kid as well. But strange. Now, why?
Hello, Goz. I've lost you again. Just got to the part where you said you went to kindergarten like everyone else, and it's just cut off.
Sick in a gradual sort of way, and it kind of extends back to 2006. I just had one thing after another. I had thyroid problems. I had amalgam problems in my teeth that were causing me a lot of heavy metal poisoning. And in 2010, in particular, I started having all these infections in my mouth. I used to have these glandular things sort of rise in my head that made me look like a Klingon from Star Trek and things like that. A lot of other sort of fictitious sort of Star Wars-like characters. And I was just constantly having a lot of problems. I remember after I went to the dental hospital to get impacted wisdom teeth taken out, I was incredibly sick. I literally couldn't hold any food down for a couple of months after that. There's a lot of stuff that happens, and to be honest, all my life I've had a lot of illnesses, but I've always been able to overcome them and get through them all. I had all the vaccination shots with my mum being a pathologist and a right-wing medical sort of person, and she was heavily involved in medical scientific research, as I later came to find out more and more and more when I researched this thing when I was older. But from 2010 up until last year, 2014, for almost 5 years, my body started undergoing changes that were like full on. It was like my whole body was starting to fall to bits and was coming loose, at all the joints, as crazy as this sort of sounds. And I couldn't understand it. I at first thought it was because, I'd had a number of accidents in my life. I've, been off, a 100-foot cliff, in a car when I was 22 and survived that. I basically, overcame, attempted poisonings, with some very, very heavy drugs, enough sort of deadly nightshade, or otherwise known as belladonna, to kill 3 elephants. And that was only in 2012 when that happened, right on Easter too. But I'll get into that another time because that's not the main focus here. But the thing is that I seem to always come through all of these illnesses in my life and get over a lot of adversity and just get on with life, because at the end of the day, that's all you can really do. And I'm not the sort of person who really wants to be held down by anything. And so I noticed my body was starting to change. Now, as I said, I had other things as well. I was assaulted by all these state rail transit police that assaulted me one day, that 3 of them basically did all this Brazilian jiu-jitsu on me. I was working at the time in a medical company. I was a more neater appearance than I'm looking right now. By conventional sort of standards, I was in a suit and tie, the whole everything. And the one time I worked for this place, about 15, 18 months. And of course, the one time I went to work and I hopped on the train and couldn't get a ticket, I come at the other end, and what do you know, it's the transit police. So I went straight up to one of them and said, look, I don't have a ticket, but look, here's in my pocket my tickets for the last week or 2. You can see I catch it every day. The guy wasn't interested, starting right out of ticket. I started basically going, well, okay, if you're going to be like that, and he wanted my ID, and I said, well, you've got enough ID already, you don't need any more. We had an argument, and he said, well, okay, we'll just wait for the police to come, and I said, that's me fine, we can sort it out. In the meantime, I've got to hurry up and go. Hope that happens soon, because I've got to open this medical building, to start work and stuff like that. And so that was my responsibility in this job, apart from other things. And eventually this policeman didn't show. I had to get going. I tried to leave. They stopped me from leaving, and then I then waited further, and then one of these transit cops, a bit of attitude was basically flung at me from them and me at them. There was a bit of, that going on. And then one of them just decided, to throw his authority around at me and tried to shove me and tell me to go and stand in a certain place. And I said, no, mate, I'm just standing my ground here. You made your point. I said, don't touch me, the whole everything. Well, before I knew it, this guy was basically shoving me and wrestling me, and then 2 other of these sort of buffoon gorillas. They don't really train these people with any psychological insight or sort of instruction on how to sort of deal with people. They're just pretty much, sort of dumb thugs that are even too dumb to become policemen. And so that's what I was dealing with. And then the 3 of them basically slammed me to the ground and twisted my body in all sorts of directions in such a way that I wasn't able to get out of bed for the next week. I was that sort of twisted up and stuffed up and the whole everything. And when it came to court, I basically got off the fine for not having a ticket. And this guy, the 3 of them, were too gutless to come to court. And the second time they didn't come to court, I made a notion to dismiss the actual charges through the technicality of the fact that they keep on putting in lame excuses to not sort of turning up. And then the magistrate agreed with me, so basically I won the situation by technical default, because I do know the law pretty well, actually. And so, but I never had any compensation or anything like that. And when I tried to get CCTV from the police and the whole everything, I got chased out of the police station, basically. I don't want to go into that whole story because it's not a significant part of my life story when we really get into the significance of what the important parts are. But the thing was that at this stage, during 2010 to 2014, I thought that this accident, or this particular assault, my groin and my hips, like I got twisted up so badly, because the thing is about jiu-jitsu is that Brazilian jiu-jitsu, it happens in sort of all the rugby league players are trained by all these jiu-jitsu champions now. And it's a way, they know how to twist and manipulate the body and cause internal damage without leaving any external marks. And because the medical industry as we know it, when it comes to internal sort of muscular and soft tissue injuries and all of that kind of thing, unless you're paying out of your ass to see a specialist, you know, $300 an appointment or something like that, but they don't want to know about you. And all they do is just, you know, throw you painkillers and say, you'll be right. Or basically, you know, you've got a chronic injury sort of thing and this, that and the other. And they don't really want to deal with it. And yeah, I'll get more into that later. Described all of these injuries to sort of all these accidents I had. There was another situation in 2010. I was down at Bondi Beach and I was swimming between the flags. And at this stage, my injuries were really quite bad and getting worse. And I didn't know what to do. I thought it was, you know, mainly due to this sort of assault and everything like that. But then as I was coming out of the surf in barely knee-high deep water, I had this 8-year-old girl on a 3-fin thruster sort of surfboard that shouldn't have been between the flags, literally come along on the wave and just knocked me over like a 10-pin and literally hit me right in the groin, right in the critical part of the injury that got all sort of twisted up when I'd been assaulted by these transit cops. And that just knocked me for six, so to speak. And I somehow staggered out of the water. The parent that was looking after that particular child at the time saw what happened, but then just turned a blind eye. I then went and crashed out on the grass for a while, and then I noticed I couldn't open my right eye, and my whole right side of my body had twisted up. And I'm just going, oh, this is not good. And my head was spinning. But I somehow managed to get up, and I found where this little girl was and the adult supervising, and I kind of went up to them and I said, you know, that wasn't very cool what happened here. I realised young girls sort of just being a young girl and all that sort of thing, but you as a parent, you know, the fact that you didn't come to help or anything like that, just turned a blind eye. Well, and then this lovely South African guy basically said, oh, it's not my child. You know, it's like, and I thought, okay, here we go. But I was in such an injured state, I decided, well, I can't report this to the Lifesaver Guards or take issue with this guy because my situation is getting worse. So basically, I decided I had to take action on the here and now and my health. And I somehow stumbled over to a good friend of mine's place in Bondi. And she had a friend with her at the time. It was a particularly good sort of osteopath, shiatsu energy healer. And both of them put all their abilities together, and they managed to sort of get my hip back into a place where it was before the accident. It was already injured before that, but at least opened my right eye again, and I was able to sort of function a bit better again. And yeah, because I wasn't in a good way. So I was thinking it was just a combination of all these sort of normal life injuries that was kind of adding up, and my whole body was falling apart. But then I was thinking to myself, this is kind of weird because, you know, I've had pneumonia. I had chronic fatigue syndrome for a year which is called glandular fever as well, you know, for a whole year when I was 18 that put me out. I've had everything, you know, chickenpox, measles, German measles, all the rest of it. You know, my mouth pumped full of amalgam when I was sort of 17 or 18 by this rather overzealous sort of dentist. So there's been a lot of stuff going on, constant sort of emotional turmoil and just sort of distortion. My mother and father used to fight like cat and dog in a constant way growing up. It was a pretty full-on experience, and you could say I couldn't wait to get away from that environment. It was just a continual sort of pressured environment where, you know, my life was all about pleasing my parents so they could leave me the fuck alone, so to speak. And so that was my kind of attitude. And I was one of these students where half my grades would always be sort of half straight A's and the rest of them sort of C's to E's, depending on whether I was interested in the subject or not, or whether it made practical sense to me. And they could never work me out. You know, I was meant to have a very high IQ and, meant to be one of the top students, but they could never work me out and what would make me perform and underperform and all that sort of thing in the whole of my school life. And that's kind of that. So getting back to this injury, so I thought it was just a combination of all of these normal sort of accidents and things like that was just adding up. But really, the body does heal itself from certain injuries unless you have certain breaks or certain things that basically when you're in a mentally and emotionally unbalanced state, well, then the body can't physically heal. And most of the time, from most injuries, I've healed back, as do a lot of people. And what was actually going on, as I came to find out, was that my body from 2010 up until, you could say, late last year, was in late September, early October, I managed to reverse all this literal body shape shifting, where literally all my muscles and soft tissues were rearranging my whole body. And there were certain times where, what I realise now, certain activations were happening in changes that caused me incredible, like the pain was just ridiculous. And I can handle pain pretty well. But this was excruciating. And then it got to the point where the whole of 2013 and 2014 up to that time, I was in continual physical agony every day. And my whole right groin and leg was in a continual lock that I couldn't get out of. It was all twisted up and buckled, and it was just ridiculous. And so I'm thinking that that buckling and everything like that is just basically an injury from, in particular, that incident at the beach and the transit cops and a couple of other things that have basically continually aggravated that same sort of key critical mass sort of injury impact point, which was in my right groin. But from 2000, this body shape-shifting started to accelerate and become worse. And I literally thought I was going to end up in a wheelchair or worse, because I was literally watching my whole body twist out of place in ways that I'm going, this just doesn't seem possible. Like, when's an organ or something going to snap and break? Or, it's like, it was becoming very surreal. And at the same time, as much as I've studied and researched so many subjects and topics for a lot of my life, especially when it comes to conventional medicine and alternative medicine, I was really floundered as to working out what to do and what was really happening. And I'd had some successful alternative sort of advanced chiropractic work in the past after a certain car accident in 1992 when I went off a cliff in the Pacific Highway in a place near Nabiac before Taree, which was on the old Pacific Highway, which is sort of about 3 hours north of Sydney. And I thought that was quite successful, what I'd done with that, because it was a form of chiropractic that basically gets your brain back into a state of homeostasis so the body can heal itself back. And there's no sort of bone cracking or heavy manipulation as in traditional chiropractic. And I kind of went back to this guy after trying the whole conventional medicine route. Now, at this stage, I was broke, I didn't have money. And not only that, while all of this was going on, I was basically surrounded by a lot of astral tag people and friends and people that were in connection with guardians and all sorts of, strange sort of characters in that sort of realm of reality. And basically, what I didn't realise until, you could say, or fully realise, and it took me about 20 months to piece this all together and get to the bottom of it, while I was going through all of this stuff and just in physical pain every day. And some days I couldn't even walk. It was just ridiculous. And because most of this stuff is happening all internally, it's only a really kind of very conscious or intuitive person can actually sense what's actually going on. And your average person, you know, if it'd be a day where I'd be kind of walking okay, well, they wouldn't notice or recognise anything. There's a lot of these kind of very sort of, I don't know, non-intuitive, desensitised, or just programmed doctors and medical people at times would look at me and say, well, there's nothing we can do. But then there was a bigger sort of agenda to all that, as I started to find out as well. That a lot of these doctor heads of certain departmental heads in hospitals, say of like pain management clinics and what have you, and emergency clinics, are actually Alpha Lodge Freemasons that are set up right throughout society, you know, in all public service sort of government places. Because basically these people, through the whole corporate sort of law structure, that's basically the elites own the infrastructure too of the government. Well, these Alpha Lodge Masons sort of maintain all of that, and they're the silent business partners in the government corporate infrastructure. Now, I suggest to people you need to do a lot of study and research to understand how that works, because this is the real reality in the fact that in all these Western, you know, inverted commas, allied countries, we are all corporate slaves in that sense. You know, we are all owned, you know, right down to our birth certificates, you know, which is property of the City of London. You know, especially if you live in Australia, US, Canada, you know, any British stolen wealth sort of country or sort of affiliate that basically has that same sort of law structure working. And it will take you a while to get to the bottom of this, to study it all properly. And I spent a long, long time studying all of this, and there's some great people out there also educating about this stuff. And anyway, that's something that you can do in your own time, you know. But there's some things I will be going into, talking about here, that unless you do have some experience yourself or some vicarious sort of analytical study of these things, you're just going to think this is straight up crazy. But it's like, you know, how this whole matrix is sort of set up. It's set up so basically you can be a happy slave, okay, and happily distracted with, you know, the whole sort of realm of matrix activities people are given and spoon-fed, so they don't actually have to think or do anything for themselves. And I don't want to go too much on a tangent down that sort of line, but it's up to people to become self-aware of the true reality of their surroundings. And if they never question anything and they just accept verbatim, you know, what's fed to them by the mainstream media and all the authorities and all the police, and look, at the end of the day, you know, they're all Crown Corporation owned subjects. And so this is the thing, getting back, you know, to these doctors that are departmental heads, and they're also Alpha Lodge Masons, you know. Even in the whole religious thing, you find some priests, you know, who are actually Freemasons as well. You know, you find some politicians, you know, some people that are scientists, deans of universities, you know. It really, that's one giant rabbit hole as it is. So if there's some things coming up that don't make sense, well, you'll need to do a little bit of research to understand it, just to begin to get to a comprehensive level of what's being talked about. And I'm not trying to say that in sort of any sort of egotistic way. It just is what it is. It's like I had to go down so many deep rabbit holes just to understand my own experiences and what was happening with my life. It's just ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. But I guess the upside to it is, well, you know, you actually get to learn about what's really... I don't know, a lot of people, I don't know, everyone can make their own choices regarding that. Now, so getting back to these doctors, well, I'll cut to the chase of it. Every time I was going to emergency wards, pain management clinics and what have you, I'd just end up getting blocked. The most I'd ever get was a bunch of painkillers. Get a couple of doctors along the way that were good people, that did the most within the realm of their experience and what they're taught and knowledge. But most of the time, and even my GP, he was basically bought out, which means general practitioner here in Australia. He was basically paid off by Masons to just basically keep me at bay. And I couldn't understand why every direction I went in, I was getting closed doors. You know, from everything over the years, from professionally to this, to trying to get help to find out what's wrong with my injuries. And what it took just to get some MRI scans just to see internally what's going on, because they're very expensive things. And unless you're sort of working well and got good medical insurance, and you're not going to be able to afford that. That's why it's a business of disease. And so if you're just going through the normal public health system, you know, you kind of got Buckleys. And if the cover of your book and your personal appearance is not, you know, the straighty 180 looking sort of standard garden variety matrix vegetable, well, then some doctors and people like that too start looking at you strange. And then when you start talking all intelligent and you're actually informed and you know what's going on, well, then they start getting intimidated. So you just can't win in that sort of regard sometimes with some certain people that are just completely ego-driven and very arrogant, where they use their status and position in society as a defining factor of who they are. But really, at the end of the day, on a soul level, it doesn't mean shit. And so it's funny as I talk through this, because it's so detailed, some of this, and I don't know what kind of level of details to go into this.
Just go for it, Goz. Just go with the flow. Just whatever you want to tell.
Yeah. And one of these doctors, he was a professor. He's head of the pain management clinic at St Vincent Hospital here in Sydney. And when I initially got referred from there, from the third time I went to emergency, and I eventually saw a good doctor with the first two experiences in emergency. Well, the first time they kicked me out after the doctor, I just described to him my injuries and what was going on, and he did no medical examination whatsoever. And they always try to throw drugs at you. And the first thing I say is, look, if I keep on taking drugs like that, it's going to rot my organs, okay? You know, they actually make your body worse. And all pharmaceutical drugs, as it is, causes impotence. You know, go and have a look at Elaine Hollingsworth's book, you know, regarding all those sorts of things. You can look and research all and find all the factual data for that. But I know that anyway, because I used to work in a medical company that used to basically deal in sort of impotence and things like that. So I've got pretty vast knowledge on that sort of thing. But anyway, just moving right along. And I'd say to them, well, these drugs, okay, while they're going to sort of deal with the symptom of the pain, they're actually going to make the condition worse. Because it's like, if you don't have strong, healthy organs in your body, well, it's your strong, healthy organs that basically are responsible for the health of all the muscles and soft tissues and everything else around them. Okay? So if your organs start rotting away because you're taking too many painkillers and drugs and all that sort of thing, well, that's going to keep you in mental and eventually emotional imbalance, so you don't even heal. Yet it's taking away the pain. That's why you have so many chronic people in conventional medicine, sort of public hospitals, that are just cripples all their life from injuries, and they never get better because, as I said before, the body's not going to heal if you're not in a reasonable mental and emotional balance. Now, I knew all this stuff, and so I'm saying to them, I said, look, I know how to deal with the pain. You know, I can either use Zeng Shui, sort of Chinese red substance, I can use some magnesium spray, or I can use some action balm. You know, I've worked out all the best things that are out there that actually work for all the things for pain. And I said, and the problem is that the whole conventional medical focus on pain, well, for these types of injuries and stuff, is pain management. And that's a joke. And I'd say to them, forget about the pain management. I'm managing my pain fine. Let's look at the root of the actual problem here and not try to just sort of band-aid the symptoms. And let's get to the bottom of this. And I want to find out why my whole body is all twisting up and why I've got these injuries and why they're not healing and getting worse. Because I'm doing all the right things. You know, my diet isn't too bad, even though I don't have much money and all the rest of it. Everything is not adding up here. And this is continually getting worse. And I'm articulating this all rather straight up and intelligently, without hesitation, without pondering. And this particular pain management clinic, I first went, and what they did in the first appointment, they first got me to fill in this sort of questionnaire. And halfway through the questionnaire, I'd already analysed the whole approach aspect of it. And I just went, this is bullshit. This is just, you know, neuro-linguistic programming where they're trying to get your responses all to the pain and then put a psychiatric evaluation to it and the whole everything. And I thought, oh, I know where this is leading. This is horrible. Rather than focus on the actual, you know, where the pain is, what's causing the pain, and how to deal with it. You know, the questions weren't about all of that. And I saw through the whole thing straight away, and I just went to the nurse. I said, look, I'm not filling out the rest of this. This is kind of neuro-linguistic programming. I even wrote it down to say why I wasn't finishing it. And I said, at the end of the day, I'm not into basically giving a whole lot of data that they're then going to use on a contortional data checklist to say, oh, okay, because he's got this symptom, this symptom, this symptom, then he's definitely got this, he's definitely got that. Where basically you know nothing about someone's injury until you are fully aware as a healer or doctor or anything like that of that person's experiences and situational sort of occurrences with what's happening in that person's life on so many different levels, from the physical, the mental to the emotional. And then when I went in to see the doctors, first was this Asian doctor that I saw, and within 10 minutes I'm giving him information on mycoplasmas and stuff like that, which is the linking pathogen to neurosystemic degenerative diseases, because I had a feeling that I had mycoplasmas exploding from certain emotional triggers because I'd gone through some pretty heavy stuff as well in that sort of regard. And I was looking at all possibilities here and being open to everything until these possibilities prove themselves to be true or false, which is the only way to get to the bottom of anything, really. And this Asian doctor, then I kind of went over his head because he wasn't prepared for the fact that, you know, I was, you know, well informed, and I'd basically taken charge of my own health and responsibility for it, and hence I wanted to get to the bottom of it. So then he basically got this other doctor in. What was his name? Andrew Richardson, I think. And he was this sort of greying, bearded guy. He was just like a big fat pork roll, really. You know, the way his body was, I thought to myself, gee, this guy's not a good epitome of, you know, the job of what he's doing. Like he's not a good example to all the patients and stuff, you know. And yet he was another one of these arrogant types that, now straight away, he started fishing for psychiatric details, drugs I may have taken in the past. And I saw what he was onto straight away. He was sniffing for any sort of dirt that he could use as contortional data, so he could basically wrap me up, you know, possibly as some sort of loony or some sort of psychosomatic, you know, sort of injury or something like that that was due to my own sort of dysfunction, what have you. And then while that was happening, I was holding my own with this guy, and then I was bringing out all my research and stuff on mycoplasma and lots of other things and possibilities. And then at a certain stage when I was talking and discussing stuff with him, this seemingly the head guy came in and just observed for a while, and I kind of sensed he was the head guy, and he just sort of observed, but I kept looking at this guy and thinking, now where do I know your face from? I had a big deja vu. I'm thinking, I know this guy from somewhere, but where? And anyway, I kept on talking with this Andrew Richardson guy, and eventually, after 40 minutes of no examination and just pure conjecture and talking, and I said, well, look, I've been here so far for 40 minutes. You've done no examination whatsoever. You just fished for all these details. And I said, what's going on? And then he said and then I described the injuries to him. And then he actually said to me, he said, are your injuries of a nature where you've got all this twisted sort of muscles and stuff like that under the skin, but yet from the outside, it can't be seen by the naked eye? And I said, well, yeah, it can't be seen by the naked eye for most people unless someone actually has experience and an eye for these things, okay? And then he said to me, are you prepared for the fact that if this is the case, we won't be able to help you? And that kind of waved a red flag to me. And I thought, how can this guy describe my condition and know what's going on, and yet say straight up like that, without any examination, anything like that, we can't help you? And then I said, well, okay, whatever you say, mate. And I said, well, how about we get on with an examination and get to it? I said, I don't need any pain management. Can we move off this entirely? I said, I can deal with my own pain management. I want to look at the root cause of what's causing all these body injuries that are just getting worse and worse, that are spreading right across my body. It started all mainly in the whole groin area and my hips. And he said, basically, come back next week, which just happened to be Friday the 13th of June. I reflect later back thinking, well, yeah, that's quite a coincidence, one of those sorts of things. And so I came back. When I came back the next week, I took a friend with me, because I just had a feeling I'm going to need a witness here. So basically, generally when you bring a witness to these sorts of things, the professional assessor basically has to do things properly, and they can't get away with stuff. And so I brought a witness with me, and that was a female friend of mine. But the thing was that when it came to dropping my drawers and doing the examination, well, she had to step out of the room, didn't she? And I should have brought a male trusted friend with me in that sort of regard, but at the time, I didn't really have one, nearby. Like, sure, I've got some friends, but they're all out of town. They've all moved out of here. Don't blame them, for lots of different reasons. And so that was the only person I really trusted that was close to me. So she stepped out of the room. Now, this guy, he was the main professor of the whole pain management unit, and his name is Professor Milton Cohen, okay? And he then did this quick examination, okay? I was in a lot of pain that day too, and I hopped up onto the bench. I'd taken my pants off and everything like that. And he's just doing like the normal reflexology, test to see if all your nerves are working and so that you've got normal movement, okay, which is a standard sort of procedure with most sort of doctors. But he didn't even go beyond that. And I was saying, well, what about, down in my groin here and, in my most private areas where, stuff was seriously wrong and all the soft tissues and muscles, it was like a dog's dinner. And what was going on internally. And he just took a brief look for a couple of seconds and he said, oh, that's just all natural skin folding. Now, unless you physically put your hands on someone's body, whether it's their back, their arms, no matter where these types of injuries are and this stuff that's ripped underneath, well, unless you feel what's going on, well, unless you've got a particularly trained intuitive eye, and like a friend of mine does, who's incredible with fixing people's backs and doing things. He's not even a doctor or anything trained, but this guy's absolutely amazing. And he trained himself through his own sort of car accident injuries and stuff like that, the fact that he's a very good martial artist and what have you. And I trust this guy more than, most specialists out there. I tell you what, he actually knows what's going on and he actually knows what to do to help fix people's problems. And not only that, he can identify where the problems are in the body where a normal person wouldn't be able to see at all or sense where those injuries are. Because from the outside, it just looks like when there's skin there, there's normal sort of formation of the body. And let's face it, we have 6 layers of skin. let alone all the soft tissue and the muscles and the veins and all the rest going on as well. So that's the thing about this type of internal sort of injury. And then after I was on the table, I hopped off the table, and then he specifically got me to stand on my left leg. And I said to him straight away, I said, I can't do it. I won't be able to hold myself up. I said, I'm having trouble as it is. I said, my right hip is already dislocated and popped out. And I said, my left one is the only one that seems to be just holding up at the moment. And he was insisting, and I'm saying, no. And he said, look, just do it and hold on to me. So I did it, and I held on to him. And as soon as I did it, pop, there went, my left hip went out. It was almost like, I was thinking for weeks after, I was so angry at this guy, you know. And I thought to myself, gee, I think I'm being a bit more angry at this guy than what the whole situation requires, even though I was so frustrated at the fact I was just continually getting blocked by medical people, conventional medical people anyway, and ones like this. And then after, and I managed to have one MRI at emergency a couple of months before, and they told me that I was going to have an MRI that went from my whole pelvic region down to my knee so they could see what's going on. But then when I went and had the MRI, I asked the radiologist, or the person doing the MRI, I said, what's actually being scanned here? And they said, oh, just your tailbone. And I said, is that it? I said, not the whole pelvis, nothing underneath it? He said, no. And I've gone, oh, shit. I've just waited 5 hours in emergency just to be able to get this in writhing pain. Then I had to and then they said to me, okay, we're going to book you in for an MRI. Just go back home and we'll call you. No one called me. When I called the hospital to actually say, hey, where's my appointment? Well, in the whole radiology department, imaging department, they said, oh, we have no booking for you whatsoever. So then I had to chase down in emergency saying, well, hold it, where's the referral gone? How come the referral's been lost between emergency and imaging? And so I had to chase all of that down and go through the whole hoo-ha of doing that. And then when I went to finally get it done, okay, so this is days, another week later, you know, there's all getting through all this red tape for every single procedure that goes wrong and form that gets lost. And might I add, every time at this St Vincent's Hospital, whether it was my GP, like, you know, sending me there for an X-ray or an ultrasound, there'd always be some sort of incident. You know, like say when I had ultrasound done, the woman said, oh, this is going to take an hour. And then when it came to doing it, it's like she went out of the room for about 10 minutes, all of a sudden, abruptly, someone called her, and then she came back in, and then it was like she spent 5 minutes doing the ultrasound, and then she said, that's it. And I said, well, you just told me that was going to take an hour. He said, and then she just went blah, 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 whatever, you know, some feeble excuse. And then when I went back to my GP, he said, I still haven't received the results, just kept on waiting. And I said, well, bugger this. I'm going into the hospital myself and finding them. And I found these x-rays and ultrasounds literally in a back bin, you know, in the administration sort of area where you go to book in to have all these things done. And I had to direct staff there to go and find things, you know. It was just ridiculous. And so my continual whole way through the hospital experience, conventional medicine, every report, every test I had done, it would always get lost or misplaced, or basically it was like in this case, it was the wrong MRI. And when I went in, again, they said to me, look, you'll have to go through emergency and they'll give you the referral again. So I went into emergency, as I said, waited 5 hours. Then this nice kind of doctor guy, as you see me, said, yeah, no worries, we're going to give you that MRI. And, you know, and I said, what specifically is it going to give us data on? He said, oh, yeah, you know, from from your whole pelvis region right down to your knees. And I went, fantastic. And then when I asked the imaging person, it said, well, it's only of the lumbar spine. I've just gone, for fuck's sake, you know, not again, you know. And so I went straight back to emergency after I had that imaging done. And I said, what's going on here? I was told by the doctor this was happened and this is what's happened. And I said, the lumbar spine's not going to show anything. It's just, you know, because the thing is that all the problem is with all the L discs and everything like that, it's like, how can you have a compartmentalised sort of just MRI of just the lumbar spine and work out everything else that's going on around in the whole pelvic region and whole area from there? There's only so much limited information you can get from that. And even when I got copies of that MRI of the pelvis, well, I basically went into the software myself and checked it all out myself and played the movie of all the different sort of snapshots from different angles. And you could easily see when you're putting on a rotating movie that the whole thing was out and that the hips were, you know, everything was wrong. And of course, when I got a report from them, they said, oh, yeah, well, all the L discs and this, that and the other are quite lower and this, that and the other, but there is nothing of significant sort of problem here. And it's sort of like, well, I sort of wrote all this sort of stuff back to the people giving the reports saying, well, you haven't considered this and you haven't considered that. And what's actually causing the lowering of this, and because you don't have an MRI of that. And the thing is, at the end of the day, we need an MRI of the whole region so we can see the nature of what's happening with all the soft tissues and muscles and everything like that. And I said, you don't even have, you know, an image of the key critical mass impact area on my right groin where the worst of the injury was. So this just kept happening time and time again, Alan. It was just absolutely ridiculous. It was just an absolute nightmare.
So what?
And then,
Goz, what is the reason, and why is this conspiracy against you then to actually get the treatment that you need?
Well, what I've realised, because I ended up going to another hospital as well, and yet again, and I had a certain friend in Melbourne, and I was telling him about what was happening, and he was trying to use his Freemason contacts to try and ensure me safe passage. But to cut a long story short, he'd been basically sent in to befriend me in 2012 for a whole different agenda and reason. And his contacts weren't these so-called renegade Freemasons, anti-New World Order Freemasons. He said they were. And this guy was basically played as well by these Masons as well. And he still doesn't realise it. If he's listening now, you know, wake up, buddy, you know, because, well, I've even told him this by message, but I've got no response, you know. I sort of parted ways with him almost 6 months ago. And it was him that sort of did it, because I started to work out this whole agenda, because he was basically acting for what was actually my cousin in Melbourne that I didn't know I had. It was part of the mother's side. Once I started to realise what the truth was with my mother's side of the family and bloodlines and stuff, oh my goodness, was that a heck of a rabbit hole to go down, that I didn't expect this. I'll get onto that. But anyway, this guy, he's been a cool bloke. He was trying to help me out. He saw the distress I was going through. We used to talk every day because we used to, you know, had very high level knowledge of a lot of things. And he was someone that constantly researched things and stuff like that. So we used to talk about stuff all the time. We formed a friendship. And he was trying to pull strings for me. You know, he was genuinely trying to help me. But the problem was that these people that sent him in to befriend me, well, they had a whole other agenda and weren't who he thought they were as well. And I hope he realises this now, because I've pretty much made it plain to him. And so I'm saying, well, okay. He's saying, go over to this hospital and go and see this person and that person, and go back to your GP and get a referral. And even going back to my GP to get a referral to say, you know, I urgently need help and all that sort of thing. And here's my GP being paid off by the Alpha Masons to basically sort of keep me at bay as well. This was getting all quite ridiculous, really. And I was kind of slapping myself at times, going, through this, I'm going, I can't believe that I can't find any normal conventional medical person that's having a duty of care. I tried to get in contact with past doctors that were cool in the past and things like that. Couldn't do it. And I'm thinking, you know, it's just about every doctor out there, you know, pulled by the business of disease sort of money yoke at the moment, you know, the way that healthcare has gone. And I won't get into all of that because that'd be a whole show on itself, okay?
Yeah.
But, yeah, I was just really going, this is surreal. And in the meantime, I'm having this whole astral hierarchy thing basically play games with me and come at me and swoop at me through all these astral tag friends and people around me.
Could you
because
explain, Goz, could you explain for some of my listeners about the astral tagging and how it works, just to give a little bit of background before we actually get into that so they can understand it better? Thanks.
Yes, I will. And that's a very good question, actually, because this is something that people need to know how it works. And I didn't fully know how it worked at the beginning, and I had to work this out along as I went. And I got to the stage, I remember, in the end of 2012, early 2013, I had all these different, you could say, like soul groups of the astral hierarchy, as they call themselves, basically coming at me through all sorts of different people. And I was sort of getting fed up with it to a certain point where I'd keep open for information, like I'd always keep. And then I'd store information, whether it be in my head or on notes or all that sort of thing, or I should say my body, because that's where information is stored. There's more memory in the body than people realise in the brain ever. Anyway, that's a whole other discussion. But and you find that out through regression. And so I was pretty much saying to all these people, okay, I'm sick of all of this shit. How about they all come to the table and lay their cards out on the table instead of all this secret cloak and dagger sort of stuff that's, you know, all this privied information and, you know, there's just nothing transparent in that world. Nothing. That's the thing, you know, people think, you know, when it gets to their egos ingratiated, they're told, well, this is what you've been in a past life and you're part of this royal line and that, the other, and they start getting this sense of importance and all that sort of thing. And that's how they hook people in. And then they'll train certain people with certain abilities, teach them how to remote view, teach them how to be more psychic, all sorts of things, you know. This is what happens when certain people make knowledge contracts with astral entities and they end up getting tagged as a result. You're literally selling your soul in the sense because you no longer become the controller of your soul. You're tagged and they're basically tricking your thoughts into doing certain things. And this is where it gets onto the astral hierarchy. The astral hierarchy have got everything from sort of Dracos to disincarnate humans that are kind of stuck in limbo between sort of, you know, sort of dying in a horrible way and sort of moving on to the next place, whether it's back to the creation source or whether it's recycled, you know, as an astral, you know, second born. And a lot of times there's a lot of human disincarnate spirits that do get trapped in the astral recycling, but sometimes some of them are just hanging around still. And how the astral hierarchy works is that the ones up the top, okay, when they really, really have an agenda against someone or something, anyone that's astral tagged by a lower astral hierarchy entity, well, they can swoop straight through that person. Like basically that lower astral hierarchy entity has to make way for that higher entity that wants to basically tamper with the actions of that person that is tagged and get them into doing unconscious behaviours against a certain person they want to get to. So that's the thing. If the astral hierarchy, the top of them, certain beings want to get to you, they will. And they'll do it through any astral tagged person around you, whether it's a friend, a confidant, an acquaintance, or even people out in the public, you know? And so that's the thing. That's actually how it works. And this is where and they can play multiple angles at once through many different people. And you're thinking, well, okay, this person's tagged by this entity and this person's tagged by this entity, and yet it's actually the same higher astral entity playing you, say, through 4 different people and all different angles and making up different scenarios and controlled oppositions, playing, and then basically playing all these people against you. And in my case, what they wanted to do was keep me in a complete perpetual state of stress. Okay? And the more stressed you are and the more heightened you are in that sort of sense, well, in my case with my situation, it would just speed up the shape-shifting that's happening in my body and all the twisting, okay? And it wouldn't allow me to sort of chill out so I could start to work out a way, let alone to be in a space in order to start healing. And this even went to the point where I actually had one close friend who actually did an incredible lot to help me and take out etheric implants that have been put in me when I was younger. Okay? Now, before I get into that, I'll explain what happened to me when I was younger and how those things got there. And this person also helped me significantly, used to come into my space. I gave her permission to come into my space in order to untangle my muscles and soft tissue and stuff going on so I could untwist myself back into place. And sometimes we were very successful at doing this, but the problem was every time we did this, it would never hold, and then everything would twist back the other way, and the injury would just, especially in my right groin, it would lock up even further and be worse than it was before. And this person helped me with so much unconditional love, tirelessly, to try and help me heal. Like, the amount of time she put in was incredible. And at the end of the day, she was being used as well. Like, her genuineness and everything like that, well, she was being used by, she had actually, Tavistock fake entities, okay, guardians that were basically controlling her. But the thing is, with her, she'd managed to actually put them at bay, and I'd worked through a lot of stuff with her. And when I was working with her in, say, from March till late August last year, she'd managed to sort of, she wasn't in contact with these guardians or anything like that. And basically I'd done a lot of deprogramming with her, and, as a friend, had basically worked through a lot of stuff, and we were able to work out a lot of stuff together anyway, just on basic knowledge of some things and researching and getting to the bottom of certain rabbit holes and what's going on, so have you. And as crazy as it sounds, they ended up replacing her. And then I eventually worked out that this poor woman had 2 body doubles. Now, while they can't 100% clone, a human being, like as in sort of clone a soul or anything like that, because they just they're just not able to do that. They're not able to copy what's organic, creation source sort of stuff. They do have the ability to graft DNA and make identical sort of body doubles, and they're able to take a soul out of someone and put it in another body, and they can do all this other stuff, but they cannot replicate the actual consciousness of someone's soul. All they can do for a double is basically program them, okay? So that sounds all pretty crazy, but that is what happened. And so combination of Masons and the astral hierarchies spent a lot of time and resources at the end of it all making sure that I was to never become aware of the truth about my family and what's going on and who I am, and to just make sort of, the whole path in my life to make me look like just some loser lost in the system on disability. Okay?
Yep,
and so Well, somehow I turned it all around. And as far as the astral hierarchy was concerned, well, the hunters eventually became the hunted.
Oh, please tell me more. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah. So I hope I've explained a bit, though, about the astral hierarchy. See, this is the thing. It's like if you've got astral tag people around you, friends or acquaintances, stuff like that. See, when you're astral tagged, and I have been astral tagged. I got my first astral tag when I was 19. I got my next one when I was 29, and I had them both removed when I was 35 by an Aborigine shaman of this country, an Indigenous person of this country. I don't use the word Aboriginal because that's derogatory, because to say someone is ab-original is saying that they're not original. It's the same as the word normal and abnormal. So it just goes to tell you, well, you know, it says a lot about the people who created the English language, doesn't it? Yeah. But that's another topic for another. One of my specialties, but I'm not going there. The first human beings on this planet, okay? It's not the Africans. The Africans were the first of the second Homo sapiens seedings, okay? And the origines of Australia were actually Cro-Magnons, okay? And they came before the Adam and Eve's genetic hybridizations, of which the Homo sapiens, the first seedings and the second seedings, were the fourth Adam and Eve's, okay? So that's a topic for a whole other occasion, but I just thought I'd clarify that. So anyway, I had this shaman, this Aborigine shaman. He basically cleared me out of these entities in 2003.
How did he do that?
And the thing is, he used a combination of both Dreamtime techniques and also Tibetan techniques. And he used a lot of sound with didgeridoos and Tibetan bowls. And it's actually quite easy removing the entity once you know what's going on. But where you send the entity is the hard bit, because you don't want fragments of that entity. If you don't send it to a safe place, okay, it can basically fragment and infect anyone in the whole area that's around. So that's the important part, just letting people know. I'm not going to go into the whole, you know, how you remove entities and stuff like that, because that's basically an energetic healer or shaman's job, and you can learn that yourself. You know, if you really want to know, you can find that, you know, or I can do another show another time specifically just on that, but that's not why I'm here today. And so I had them, he used a combination of those things, okay, and he would basically balance up, you know, the chakras that were imbalanced and things like that. Now, from what I've learned since then, you don't even need to do a lot of all of that sort of stuff in a general sort of sense, because once you're centered, you're spontaneously and simultaneously using all of your energy centers / chakras at the same time in the present now. Instead of, you know, instead of activating your third eye and then sort of bouncing and balancing them off, you know, all your other energy centers / chakras from there. That's all mind discipline stuff, and it keeps you in mind focus. And the whole point is to not be in mind, it's to be in whole body intelligence, your whole instinct. And your whole instinct is all of your energy centers, CENTERS, as opposed to CENTRE, which is literally when you're in your center, you're in your whole body. You're using your whole body intelligence, okay? And that's all of your intuition, which is what they call our animal's instinct, but it's actually the smartest part of who we are. And what we all got to do on this planet, how we can remain grounded, and natural defences from all these astral maggots and parasites and things like that, and all the geoengineering and sort of ELF technology used against us, frequency weapons and stuff like that. If you remain centred, okay, if you remain in the present now and you're not stuck in your mind all the time, and you're just being in your average day-to-day life, doing one thing from another and keeping in the present now, and literally it's what it means by keeping your wits about you. It's by staying present. okay? And that way you get to use any of your intuitive energy centers as you need it, as any situation calls for in the present now. And that just happens spontaneously and simultaneously as you need it. It's actually quite simple. But we don't really have much of a conscious idea of this because this is not really taught to us much at all, anywhere. It's all this mind discipline stuff. And the more that you stay in your mind, as soon as you think, you are no longer in the present moment of now. So that's the big trap, where you have, in the present moment, you have access to the present, the past and the future because it all is a simultaneous existence. But when you're stuck in your mind, you're out of that moment. So you're more in a past or a future sort of thought sort of thing. And that's the thing, when you're disconnected from the now, that's when you're more easily manipulated, and that's when you're more prone to attacks from the astral, which is all a pineal thing, okay? A reptilian brainstem, okay? Our genetics have been manipulated to such a point that through the hollow point in the back of your neck where the brainstem is, well, that's a direct connection straight to your pineal and also your heart, okay? And in all the New Age speak, they teach that the heart is the centre, and I think I discussed all that in the last show there, Alan.
Yeah, you did, yeah.
But the heart is not the centre. So I won't go back over all of that. So, but just saying, to remain centred like that, to be present, and if you're actually eating, if you're grounded, okay, you can see on YouTube a lot of things you can do to ground, you know, walking in the dirt with your bare feet. You can basically, you know, sort of ground your mattress, your shoes, in certain ways. There's lots of videos on YouTube for that. The most important thing is to eat real food. Now, it's very hard to eat, you know, sort of dropping, you know, crap over everything, you know, regardless of the fact of whether they're genetically modified or not. But the thing is that we can, and the thing is in most food, because our soil, thanks to US foreign agricultural policy spread right around the world, you know, since the 20s and 30s, and even since the 30s, the pH in the soil in most sort of Western countries, that it's completely, you know, depleted of all the essential minerals that we need, that are the byproduct of food, that's more important than the food itself for our nutrition and well-being. Because food is only 2% of the body's requirements. It's all the minerals, you know, that are byproducts of all that, and the rest of it, that is actually what our bodies really, really need. So I suggest to people, as long as, and one thing that's depleted in the soil is magnesium, okay? We don't get enough magnesium in enough of our food, whether they're vegetables, fruit, meat, or whatever, you know? Because basically the soil is where all of those things, you know, essentially get their nutrients too. So you need to get magnesium, you need to get organic zeolite, you need to get some bentonite clay. These things keep you grounded, okay? You have all these earth minerals, and this helps keeps you grounded and centered on a physical level, okay? On the energetic level, I've just explained how you can keep centered. And I will do a video once my body heals up a little bit more, because some days my centering can be a little bit more difficult than others because my body is still healing at the moment, untwisting and shape shifting back to its original template, what it was meant to be in this life, and not some Draco freak, you know, by the age of 52 I would have turned into, if this had all kept on going, as crazy as this sounds. Now, I will get into how that came about. So it's quite simple. People worry about, before I go into the childhood stuff, people, I've been seeing on Facebook and stuff, what can we do to ground? What can we do, you know, to protect ourselves against all these nasty sort of technologies and things and sort of weaponry that they're using against people? And like, as I was talking about the Lily wave and how they, you know, they got stuff going through the electricity of the TV. Well, this is the thing. If you eat as much organic stuff as possible, you're not drinking tap water that's full of fluoride, you're not eating sort of fiction cartoon food that's, you know, full of garbage. Well, then those things are natural immunities. And it's the same thing. Vaccines create the bloody illnesses that they're meant to actually protect against, okay? And I'm not going to go into that whole thing now as to the hows and whys. There's plenty of people, all the data and evidence is out there if people care to research it. And then if you're staying in the present moment and you're centered, because if you're in the present now, well, they can't get to that as much. They can try attacking you and doing things, but really it all just bounces off like water off a duck's back, because if you're remaining in the present now doing things and you're not stuck in your mind all the time and you're just in a constant mind focus and you're in the zone, so to speak, as people talk about in sport and music when they're performing at their best, it's when you're in this single-minded, I'm not even going to call it single-minded, but it's when you're in a focus, okay, that you're just doing. And when you're doing, you're not thinking. And everyone performs their best when they just do, okay? As soon as you think, you're no longer there. So how can you be doing your best? And any performer or sportsman knows exactly what I'm talking about, or in any sort of creative physical expression, you know, of doing anything. And so it's not as difficult as people realise. It's meant to be simple. And this is the thing, when people learn all these new age texts and all the rest of it, it's all these complicated mind focus sort of stuff. And the thing is that it's like anything that you learn intellectually, you have to unlearn it back to your intuition so that you can do it by your intuitive sense, so you don't have to think about it anymore. Now that takes a lot of work. You know, that takes time in the office like anything that you learn. But the thing is that once you do something by feel and intuition, you don't have to think about it anymore, and hence you do it to your best abilities, because you just do it. And you have enough trust in yourself that what you're going to need, that you've done in your homework, you know, with all your left brain sort of mental sort of activity, because we do need our brains for critical evaluation and stuff like that. But the whole thing is that we're not meant to live our lives, you know, which is the whole thing of the Matrix, where they just teach us, you know, everything, you know, our consciousness is just our brain or our heart together, and the rest of our body is just biological function that just, you know, props up the brain and the heart. Your whole body, your whole nervous system is intelligence. That's the thing. And in the Matrix, that's why the number 9, everything adds up to the number 9. And number 9 is the symbol for the head, for the skull. That's what it was in Phoenician before lettered languages. And they want you to keep focused on the mind all the time, because once you're focused on the mind and you're operating your reality out of that ego mind construct, they got you. They can get to you. But if you're not always operating in your mind and you're integrating your mind with the rest of your body intelligence, like all your energy centers and chakras, and you integrate it, that's the big Matrix override switch. Okay, anyway, I'm going to now discuss when I started to realize what was actually causing my body to shapeshift and to totally change form, and also this horrendous sort of right groin injury that was just getting worse, that was adding like a complication on top of this sort of shapeshifting that was starting to happen all over my body. It wasn't just my groin anymore. It was affecting everything, my head, my neck. Things were changing everywhere, and I'm just going, how is this happening? You know, and I thought it was all related to this groin injury just getting spreading throughout my body through all the, you know, referred pain and what have you, and injuries that it would create from one injury just getting worse in one area of the body. Well, it's going to eventually affect everywhere else. I was looking at this from a rather logical point of view, despite entertaining all possibilities. And then when this astral hierarchy, this one particular astral hierarchy figure, which I'll mention who is later, was sort of playing me through all these people, I started using them for information, in the sense of, it's just like in any realm, whether it's on the physical reality or the invisible reality of things, when you start finding you're getting the same piece of information that's said in a completely different, independent, respective sphere or place from the other, Like, say, for instance, when you get three psychics independently saying the same thing, well, then you start to realise, hey, there's some truth in this. I've got to look at this a little bit further. Would you agree or not there, Alan? You know, in the sense of... now, what I'm getting at here is that I had these three psychic people around me, and all of them, independently from each other, were saying, Steve, I'm pretty sure you have an older sister somewhere in the world. I kind of go, oh, okay. This gets more interesting, doesn't it, you know? Okay, yeah, right. Okay, well, tell me what you reckon and all the rest of it. And then I then actually found the physical evidence, eventually, for this to be true. And then as one crack emerges, then the rest appear. Now, I'm just giving you one example of what I found out, because as far as I was concerned, I grew up with my mother and father. I was the eldest son, and I've got a brother that's 10 months and 23 days younger than me. We're both caesarean section, which I found highly unusual considering my mum is a very strong person. And then it all made sense. And then my last flatmate, who basically, unfortunately, the astral hierarchy was using against me too, but I got on with him really well, like a house on fire. We used to have amazing energy exchanges. Well, not energy exchanges, information exchanges and bouncing off each other. And he also has what I consider to be an even more extraordinary story than mine, but that's for him to tell. But, and he was an example of literally being hijacked from this lifetime and taken back in time to the 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s and trained as an operations manager for all these black ops projects. And there's a point in what I'm about to tell you where, as crazy as his story sounds, well, I actually got to validate it through my own experience once I opened up this memory that I had of always being in this garden at this place in Mossman that I was talking about earlier, okay, in the interview. So my friend from England, actually, who was helping me do all the healing and stuff I was discussing before, one day when she was looking through my body and doing some healing on particle levels, blood levels, biocell levels, looking at the shapes of my muscles and what was going on, and she said, you know what, Goz? She said, just looking at your body now for a while and working on it every day and, you know, helping you, trying to undo all this sort of shape-shifting, twisting and all the rest of it. Well, that's when she said, you know what, twisting, you're actually shape-shifting. And I said, hold it. Now, that is not meant to happen, you know? You know, you're not born into this human life in this day and age.
So she said to you that you were shape-shifting?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I'm kind of going, now, she's not the sort of person to lead me up the garden path, far from it. Very empathetic and caring human being. One of these real salt of the earth motherly types, you know? And she had much enduring compassion and empathy for a lot of people, and she'd helped a lot of people in her time and life, and she's very consistent in that sort of regard. And she was saying to me, she said, look, you know, after sort of looking at your body and healing you and, you know, undoing all these twists and then the twists reforming again, the whole everything, and looking at the shape that your bones are going into, that your muscles and soft tissue are rearranging them into it. Because, like my shoulder, like I literally felt my shoulder blades were being sort of flattened out and reshaped. And I used to take the piss. I said, it's almost like my shoulder wings. I'm going to sprout some bloody wings one day or something. This is weird. I could literally feel, you know, that everything was going dislocated out of place yet. And when those times had happened, that would be some serious pain going on there. You know, that they're almost like activation sort of points that periodically happen like that. And so she's saying to me, she said, Goz, you're shape-shifting. And I said, no, that's not meant to happen. Hold it. How on earth that started to happen in my life? how do you just genetically have a DNA change like that, you know, to have an activation, especially in middle age? And I said, you know, I haven't had any MyLab abductions or, you know, abducted by greys or any of these sorts of things that you hear about and whatever. And I'm not invalidating the experience of others that haven't, but as far as I'm concerned, no way. You know, I've got a memory like an elephant. I'm very conscious of what's going on. And she said to me, she said, look, I'm being very serious here. And not only that, looking through your lines, she says, you're going to have another activation at the time when you're 50. And that was enough for me. I just went, holy shit, what the heck is going on here? How did this come about? And then I discussed things with her, and then I said, well, I guess I do have some lingering memories and things that I saw when I was a child. And I know some of that stuff is buried now, because it's like what happens in life, the more that happens down the line, and similar sort of semantic dynamics of things that get played out in the present sort of basically bury initial destroyed experience, sort of seed experiences, to the point you can't remember what the first experience was. And but yet I still had a lot of memories of a lot of situations and things that happened, but I didn't have the full memories. I just have what's like called an in point, okay? A memory flash, or I'd remember a certain part of it, but I'd blocked out the more painful part, you know, or part of an experience that happened that was so painful, and that you've had such similar experiences in the here and now in your life after that, and eventually that seed experience becomes buried. And what they call in the Vedic tradition, they call them samskaras, psychological imprints. And what happens is that they're like a little scar that happens in your own astral sphere, okay, as opposed to the astral zone outside your own biofield. And the more that destroyed experience is triggered by similar experiences you go through life, that little scar just gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it becomes a big blockage in your astral, and functional behaviour in order to cope and deal with that. Because when that sort of trigger and emotional dynamic gets through to the core of you, well, basically your dysfunctional behaviour and that blockage in the astral is actually trying to stop that from doing that. That's why it sort of builds up and scars. And when you have a regression therapy, what you're doing in regression is you're revisiting that initial samskara, that psychological sort of imprint, that destroyed experience, as quite often is the case. So you can literally go back in your own astral zone, which is the only safe astral zone to be in as far as I'm concerned, because it's in your own biofield, and it allows you to holographically play back in regression what actually went on. And that memory is usually contained somewhere in your body, okay? And you can get a connector. You could basically, you know, this is where I have no problem with the third eye meditation stuff. I do this all centered now, but still, you know, the third eye meditation, the regression stuff is actually good, because when it only involves you being the client and a connector, you're basically just operating in both of your astral zones, okay? The connector is connecting to the clients, what they're going through, and how they do that is you both get into a third eye state, and the connector basically, you know, gets their hand and goes over their whole body and looks for like a hot, and not so much looks, but senses and feels out either a hot spot or an energy drop. Now, as soon as you basically sense that, when you're going, putting your hand, say, like 6 inches above that person's body or just above their skin, you drop straight down onto that spot. And right on that spot where you feel that hot spot or that energy drop, incident is in the body, okay? And then what happens is that you focus on that area, and then the client actually goes and regresses the memory that's actually contained in that part of the body where that sort of hot spot energy drop is. So that's where the regression starts. That's how you start doing it. And some people can have a lot of them all over their whole body. Now, this experience can happen either in your early childhood or sometimes it's still lingering from a past life, okay? And so you soon find out what it is because the person then goes and regresses and goes through the incident. And now what the connector's job is to do is to lead the person towards what they need to see that was the root cause of this samskara, this psychological imprint, but without telling the actual client what to see or what to do. They just give them little clues by saying, oh, did you see that tree up ahead? Or, did you walk past here? Maybe you might want to sort of look a little closer, up the stairs there, because there's all sorts of, scenarios that can come out as someone's exploring stuff. And sometimes if someone's having a little bit of a blockage as they're going through stuff, that's what the connector's job to do, is to guide them to seeing the whole scenario for themselves. And if they get stuck, just give them a little sort of thing, just a little thing. Oh, do you remember that little thing down there that's not significant to what they need to see, but it's actually part of the scenario in what was going on, what was happening. So it's actually not going to destroy it for them. Because if you tell people what happened to them and they don't see it for themselves, well, that doesn't help heal them, because the whole point is that once you get to see what happened for yourself, then when you're looking back, reflecting and regressing on this, you can see the whole situation for what it was from an objective point of view. And once you can do that, well, that's half the road to the healing already done, having that realization. And when, oh, that's what happened. Oh, okay. Oh, that's no longer buried in me at all. And what happens is that you reduce that huge sort of astral scarring, big blockage that's sort of built up over the years, back down to a little minuscule sort of pea little seed, and it stops being a big blockage, in your etheric being. Okay? And then people are able to sort of go about their lives again, and when those trigger points come along for that sort of thing, well, it doesn't trigger all that dysfunctional behaviour and sort of hurt and stuff like that anymore, because they understand what happened, okay? So what I did, now I've done a lot of this regression work with people, that's why I can talk about this, and I've got quite a bit of experience in this sort of thing, and so I just decided to tell people how this sort of works in a brief sort of way. But ultimately you have to experience this stuff to become familiar with it, okay? If what I'm talking about gives any sort of insight, that's great. But for those who have never looked at this before, it might sound a bit crazy because you can't conceptualize it. Well, it's not an intellectual conceptualization. It's something that you have to do to experience yourself in order to find out. And I'll just leave it at that. And until you do, just be a little bit reserved in your judgment, okay? And don't write it off, because just because something is out of your line of experience, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, okay? I'll just leave that one at there. So what I did was I got my friend. I said, well, okay, if this is the case, I said, I think I need to open up some childhood memories and a bit further and have a look around there. And I've always had a particular knack of when I really want to focus on something, I kind of go straight to it. And so I was kind of, okay, I'm at this stage. I'm going, here I am in middle age. My body's, twisting up like a B-grade Hollywood, sort of fiction movie sort of thing. Some bloody shape-shifting thing, and, straight away people are going, oh, here's another one talking about reptilians and David Icke and shit, and another crazy nutter, Okay, fine. But the thing is that I had to get to the bottom of this, because this was real for me. Like, in real life, my body was twisting up here. I couldn't get medical people to help me. If anything, I'm getting Freemasons to block my passage. I don't want to go into all the details of all that medical stuff. I might get back to some of it, because if I go into all of it, it's just too horrible, to be honest. And I'm still sort of, I can cope with all of it, but it's like one of those things when you bring back all the details of too many destroyed experiences. It doesn't do you any good. It just makes you relive it over and over and over again. And that stuff, dealing with medical people and just having that constant validation, and this Professor Milton Cohen guy he wrote me off as a psychiatric loony and all this sort of thing, and he was very, very, very nasty. Well, I will tell you in the next phase, after what I'm about to tell you now, why I mentioned his name and where I remembered him from. But that's to come later. And I wasn't expecting this, okay? And I'd had a few psychics, as I told you, tell me many different things about myself that picked up on. And I'm one of these people that quite often when a friend of mine goes and has a psychic reading with someone, for some reading that psychic person, energy person, whatever, energetic reader, for some reason, because they have some caudal attachment to me, my stuff spills over into their psychic reading. And I've had many friends come to me over the past years saying, "Hey, I just went to see this psychic guy or woman," and it's like, and we're doing stuff on me, and then all of a sudden information about you popped up for some reason. They gave me some message to say this is what's going to happen coming up, and this is blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. So I've had quite a lot of that in the past. And so I've had some friends and these people around me. As I said, my last flatmate, this woman from England, person from Melbourne, and they're all sort of telling me the same things independently of each other, and you start to look into it a little bit closer and you think, well, maybe there's some truth to some of this, but, I've got to kind of remain open here until things become a little bit more tangible and clearer. And I then got my friend from London and I said, well, how about you help me do the regression? Now, I did a regression for her, and she was a more advanced sort of psychic sort of person who'd been trained by guardians, as I mentioned that they were earlier, from when she was very, very young. And I have to say that the way she used her abilities and stuff like that, she's quite phenomenal. And so when I was doing regression and helping her at the beginning of 2013, I was actually getting somewhere with her big time in opening up her childhood memories and stuff like that. And once I got to a certain point, well, they went and bloody replaced her, didn't they, again? And it was not until over a year later that the real one of her came back, that I experienced between March and August last year. Anyway, I got her. I said, look, can you be the connector for me in this regression? I said, I think I'm advanced enough now in doing regression for quite a while now, for over 20 years, from when I first learned how to do this stuff. And I said, look, let's go into the space here. And I started regressing this childhood incident, and she held the space for me. And I said, I want you to guide me if I kind of get a little bit lost or I don't know where to look next. But I said, I don't want you to tell me anything significant. I've got to see this all for myself. Otherwise, this thing doesn't work. And the whole thing is that when you are doing regression too, quite often what happens is that once you get to a certain point in the regression and you see a couple of key things for yourself, literally the whole memory comes flooding back all at once. And I've experienced that many times in that regard. And that's exactly what happened in this situation. So I said to her, and this was like about 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, after a night, because, look, I tell you, when your body starts shape-shifting over a few years, well, the way your body shape-shifts, well, it kind of stuffs with your whole day-night cycle, I tell you what. Because when your body just decides to change and do things, well, it's not going to clock in and clock out like a normal sort of 9 to 5 sort of thing, is it? Yeah. And so... And so this kind of turned me upside down and sideways for many years. But, I've been a musician for many years before that. And so that didn't bother me too much. At least you're sort of playing on the other end of the clock as it is when you're playing late in clubs and all that sort of thing, and sessions and recordings. And so I started doing the regression, I don't even need to shut my eyes while I'm doing this. I can focus on something like doing a long stare and see what's going on. Sometimes I shut my eyes just a little bit just to get a focus, but once I'm kind of in the focus, I'm there. And I was in the backyard. Oh, the one significant thing I was going to say before this is that my last flatmate said to me that when he'd been basically trained all over the world, he was in Australia in particular in the late 60s and early 70s, and he said, and he pointed out to me these couple of places, and he says, oh, there's a couple of Starfire ritual sort of temples, one in Maroubra and one in Mossman, and he showed them to me. He said, I've been to these places. And the thing is that with him too, he was still, you know, documenting his own memories of being in that life that he was transported to, that he got brought back to once he'd died in that life. But that's a whole other story, you know, as crazy as that sounds. And he said to, and he pointed out this house to me the synchronicity of this was quite uncanny. Only like a few weeks before or a month or two before, I can't remember clearly at this particular moment, but that was last year. And and as soon as I saw this mansion that he pointed out to me, I went, holy cow, this is the place I have all the memories of being in the back garden. And this mansion was owned by the Theosophical Society. It was bought by Charles Leadbeater himself in the late 20s, and they still own it today. So straight away, I kind of went, oh my goodness, what was I doing there in the back, you know, in the back gardens of this house while my mum was going there and hanging out with all these, you know, crazy professors and medical scientists. And already my deep gut feeling or centre, you know, was starting to tell me, no, there's something going on here. No wonder I blocked all of this. And so I put myself in the backyard, and I used to play in these grounds, and there was quite a lot of like statues and bird baths and things like that. A 4-year-old can sort of, you know, play around and have fun and amuse themselves, and there was lots of flower beds and all that sort of thing. And I'd go up to the house, to the kitchen sometimes, and there'd be this maid, and she used to give me sort of drinks and these horrible shortbread biscuits and all that sort of thing, and kind of keep me amused sometimes. And I'd be playing out in the garden like any 4-year-old. Once you sort of exhausted all your creative possibilities of playing around, I'd go up to the house thinking, okay, Mum, you know, when are we going to go? I'm a bit bored, you know. And she'd be talking to, you know, this main professor or one of the other sort of doctors or scientists, either on the downstairs balcony and the side and the back of the house, or the upstairs one. Now, this one particular day, Mum was taking ages, and I was starting to get restless. And I went into the house, the mate gave me something to drink, had shortbreads, and I just thought, oh, I'm sick of this. And then my curiosity got the better of me too, because this was a creepy old house. It had about 30 rooms to it plus. And it had lots of unusual pieces of artwork and paintings, and it's what I describe as a kooky old place. And kooky in the sense of doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It's just kooky. It's odd, weird, which I kind of find interesting until I get to the bottom of things. And so I started looking around downstairs in all these rooms. And in one of these rooms, one thing really grabbed me. There was this old ancient statue, and it looked like this. It was like this African guy, this statue, and it had eyes on it that were like really creepy. And it got my fascination, but it used to just creep me out so much. I'd kind of go into the room, look at it for a while, and then sort of run out again. And then I'd sort of sneak back into the room, look at me. And as a kid, it was so creepy. It almost felt like it was looking at me kind of thing, you know. It was a bit... And so I started wandering around the rooms, you know, having a bit of a free range of the house downstairs. But then I noticed eventually downstairs, no, Mum was not to be, okay? and I was a pretty sneaky 4-year-old, sort of looking around, and there'd be the occasional person, but they wouldn't sort of take much attention of me or bother me or anything like that for some reason. They all seemed to know that I was, the doctor's, little kid or something like that. And being a little kid, they weren't too worried about much. But I was very conscious in my awareness, even as a 4-year-old, in the sense of looking at things and seeing things and being aware of what was going on. And it took me a lot of courage to eventually go upstairs, because I kind of realised, well, Mum must be upstairs, because I've seen her on the balcony before. But I remember going on the landing on the stairs, halfway up the stairs, and spending ages there trying to summon up the courage to go upstairs, because I was thinking, well, maybe if I go upstairs and they see me up there, I'll get into trouble because I'm not meant to be there. And so I eventually did summon up the courage, and I did get up the stairs. And as my friend is sort of guiding me, I remember I got stuck on the stairs for a while in the regression. And she was saying to me, she said, can you remember what you did after that? And I said, well, I remember being stuck on the stairs, and I'm trying to think what I did after that. And then she said to me, she said, well, just take a little bit further look up the stairs, and you might remember a whole room, a hallway with a whole heap of doors. And then I went, yeah, that's right. So that's what you do as a connector. You basically lead the person to the next sort of phase of what happens without telling them anything significant, of the significant sort of details of when you get to the main event. You see that for yourself. So I got up the stairs, and then I went, oh, yes, I remember. I started trying to look through all the rooms upstairs, and there was a lot of rooms, and some of the doors were locked, and some of the doors weren't. And same thing with all these rooms, lots of creepy looking stuff and things going on. And then eventually I got to the last room at the end of the hallway, and I went into this room, and when I opened the door, I saw the back of his head that was slightly balding, and he kind of had like a brown sort of wavy head with a slight sort of reddish sort of tint to it. And he was sitting in this leather chair, and it was just motionless. It was just like this head. And I was kind of, as I looked through all these rooms and stuff like that, I was really nervous and scared, because I felt, ooh, this is really creepy. I'm picking up on lots of creepy energy, as you do as a child. But as a child, your curiosity gets the better of your pain. And so that kind of overrides the fear. And because many, many times I'd kind of sneak up to the door, I'd open it, then I'd shut it, then I'd open it, then I'd go in a little bit further, I'd run back, and then I'd go further again, and just build up my courage each time to go further and further. And eventually I found myself at the side of the professor sitting in the chair. Now this professor in the chair, I wouldn't have known what the word catatonic was back then, but looking back now as an adult, even back then he seemed to be in a catatonic sort of state where it seemed like he was dead. He just wasn't moving, but really he was in a deep trance. And, he was on some sort of drug, some sort of something. And so then I was right beside him, and then I started looking very closely at him and coming up close to him like a kid does. It's curious. And then eventually out of nowhere, he just snapped out of the state that he was in, looked at me, was a little bit sort of, what the fuck are you doing here sort of look. And then he immediately got up, and he just went straight out of the room without any hesitation and shut the door. And that kind of just alarmed me a little bit, and I thought, oh, God, I'm in trouble. What have I done? That was my immediate thing. So it might give you an indication of what growing up with my parents was like and my nature, because I was always a very curious kid. And even at 2 years old, I used to, in the morning before my mother and father used to get up, I would leave the family house and I'd always be found in the neighbourhood in someone's like rose bed or flower bed, digging all the soil up or doing something like that. This is when I was 2 years old. You know, I'd be halfway up the street in someone's garden doing that. So even at that age, I'd kind of negotiated, you know, I knew not to sort of, you know, walk on the middle of the road. I could see cars coming and things like that. And I had a natural sense of danger and what to do and what not to do. And that stopped one day when my parents eventually got a fence. And I'll never forget that. That's one sort of memory etched in my memory, that this one day I kind of went down, I was about to walk out the path, and then all of a sudden there's this big gate there. And I just literally grabbed the gate and I just started shaking on it just to try and open it and get it out of the way. And I just shook it and shook it and shook it. And eventually my parents woke up in their bedroom in the front room of this house. Then I remember looking up and seeing my mother and father looking down at me at the gate. And I'm just giving them just the, you know, I'm looking at them like and shaking the gate going, how could you do this? How could you do this? You know, I was just frustrated. You know, I couldn't get out. And they're just kind of smiling and laughing. Oh, you know, must have looked like a cute little rotten child in a certain way like that, you know. So there he is. He's trying to get out and about. And all you're doing as a kid really is just being curious, you know, just trying to find out about things and do things and what have you. And so that's the kind of kid that I was like. So at that stage, it was kind of like, the professors, you know, stormed out of the room, shut the door. I'm thinking, oh shit, I'm in trouble again. And then eventually I kind of was there pondering for a moment, and I thought, well, and I was a bit nervous to go up to the door and open it and to go out, but I thought, I've got to get out of this room. And so eventually I opened the door very, very carefully, the handle, and to my relief, it wasn't locked. And I opened the door and there was no one in the hallway, and I gone, phew. And then I just thought to myself, okay, I've had enough of this. Where's Mum? Where's Mum? And because that was the last sort of room at the end of this hallway, at the end of the hallway was the other side of the house and the entrance to the balcony on the second story level. And quite often when I'd come up to that, underneath that balcony from the garden, just to check to see where Mum was at, to see whether she was ready to leave or not on previous occasions, I went out onto that balcony and I noticed that Mum wasn't there. And I'd noticed that downstairs as well, when I checked out all downstairs, she wasn't on the downstairs balcony before that happened as well. I just left that out before when I was telling the story. So I walked along the balcony, she wasn't there, and then I then went to the back part of the balcony as it L-shaped around, and there was the professor, and he was leaning against the balcony, and he might have been smoking a pipe. I can't remember exactly on that part. He might have been. I think, or he was sort of playing with it in his mouth or something like that. He may not have been smoking it. And then I went up to him and just point blank said to him, I said, where's Mum? Where's Mum? You know? And then he didn't even say a word to me. And I looked up to him, and then he motioned to me with his head, and then he got his index finger and pointed towards the two doors of the room. It was kind of like a French design sort of, I'm trying to think of what those French doors are called, and, you know, sort of elegant sort of mansions and stuff. Just the word evades me for now. Come back to me later, but that's what the doors were like. And I walked in to that room that he pointed to, and when I walked into the room, it was like this big old study with lots of wooden built-in sort of bookshelves, and it had a wooden desk with one of those sliding sort of wooden sort of covers that you can lock, you know, sort of a real sort of old school desk. And it was looking very sort of 1800s or early 1900s, so to speak, the whole sort of style of the place. It was very Victorian. And what grabbed my attention straight away was that on all the shelves in this study were these big clear jars with all these strange looking creatures in them. in sort of like preservative fluid. Now, when I said strange-looking creatures, I'm talking like giant reptile frogs, lizards, the most exotic-looking things you've ever seen, and some of them were literally alien-looking, like what you see on the internet from some of the crazy-looking things that they've dug up in South America sometimes, you know, and, you know, they've gone, what is this, you know?
Wow.
And there were all these crazy-looking things, and literally some of them, and they're predominantly sort of like lizard, frog, just reptilian, you know, just a lot of exotic looking like sort of animals that you'd probably find in some sort of exhibitions of such things, maybe in zoos or something like that, or certain museums. But there were literally some alien looking things that, like, I literally had never seen again until I saw some of, you know, the conspiracy things you see of such things, or on conspiracy sites and things like that on the internet. And I'm spending ages just fascinated looking at these things, but it was also creepy as well. It was just like, my goodness, what's going on here? And then after I've looked around this study for quite a bit, I noticed that there's a small little corridor at the end of the study, more towards the door that you would come into the room from the hallway, as I came into the room from the balcony, okay, from the professor pointing in. Now, I walked down that little narrow passageway and it led to another adjoining room. And in that room there was like a queen-sized bed that opened out into this room. And my mother was on this bed with this guy, and she was on top of him in an unusual sort of way, where she was kind of lying on top of him, and he was sort of like on his side, half on his side, half on his front. And she was doing something at the back of his neck. And I couldn't quite see properly from the front view, so I went round to the side of the bed and observed what was going on. And she's putting this needle and injecting something into the back of his neck, just above where the hollow point is behind your neck, where I explained that reptilian brainstem. And you've also got a hard bit of bone at the back of your head as well. So between that hard bit of bone and that hollow point, she was injecting something. Now, and then I kind of moved a little closer, and then the man who had his eyes shut at that stage all of a sudden sensed my presence and opened his eyes and gone, oh, sort of like that. And that's when I went, Mum, like in a questioning sort of tone. And then my mother looked around at me, and same with this man. They were completely alarmed that I was in the room, and they quickly kind of, you know, moved quickly and got up off the bed and the whole everything, and sort of, yeah, they were in a huge flap.
Excuse me.
And my mum's obviously thinking, what the hell are you doing here? And so I thought to myself, what have I walked in on? What's going on? Why is Mum on this bed on top of this man? You know, why is she lying on him in the way that is, the whole everything? And this is all freaky. And so I turned around to go out of the room, walk back down that little passageway, and then before I knew it, the professor was walking towards me down that hallway, and I looked up at him, and he kind of had this stony face, but he had a little grin on his face. And I looked up at him, and before I could say boo or anything, I felt this sharp prick underneath my chin into my throat. And he just injected me with God knows what. Okay, and he injected me with some substance. And then before I knew it, I felt my body starting to seize up, and I was literally going into some sort of trippy state. I don't know what. And then after he did that, he kind of lifted me up on the bed and put me on the bed. And I was kind of a bit like a vegetable after that. And then they all went out of the room. and I somehow managed to just... I was just on the bed and I was kind of half paralysed, but I was just managed to keep my consciousness. And then the next thing I remember after that was I was in my mother's car outside the front of the mansion, and she was talking to this guy, this professor, and I'd sort of come to. And she was talking to him, and I remember her saying to him at some stage, you know, is he going to remember? Is he going to remember? Is he going to remember? And she said, don't worry about a thing. He's not going to remember anything. And then my mother drove me home after that. And all the way home, my mother, while she was driving the car, she was holding onto my wrist. And she was holding onto my wrist so tightly, it was like it really hurt. But what I could see, my mum, when my mum kind of used to sort of lose it, as everyone does, at some sort of stage when you're growing up, you know, whatever, she'd kind of get this exasperated, you know, sort of make this sort of noise when she was frustrated, you know, everything. But what I could sense, like all the way home, she was just sort of making this sound, and she was obviously freaking, thinking, what the hell am I going to do now? Like, I just obviously walked into something I was never meant to see, let alone know about what was going on.
Did you ever find out what was going on then, Goz, with the injection in the neck?
Oh yeah. It's unfortunately I've had to take this long in the interview to get to this point, because this is where things really get rolling. Yes. But I had to sort of explain this whole background and briefly sort of sum up my life in a brief sort of way, trying to give enough background to this sort of point, to how I came to sort of working all of this out. Now, what I realised when I initially regressed this whole experience, at the point of when the professor injected me into the neck, as I was sort of remembering, you know, each pocket after I regressed, what happens is that when you're doing a regression, say if you're physically injured or someone stabbed you with a knife or you're shot or something like that, you literally feel that pain. But that pain is on the etheric sort of astral level, because when you're having the replay, not only do you get the replay of the visuals, you get the replay of essentially what, you know, what's actually happening. So you actually get to feel, and the whole thing is, I might say to people, is that when you do regression or anything, what comes before the visual is the feel, okay? So ultimately, and this is why people with visual abilities can be so easily hijacked, because you're able to get into visual stuff and pineal tricks and all that sort of stuff without fully feeling stuff. So to fully get correct visuals of stuff that actually really happens, and so that you're not fooled down any sort of astral tricks that, you know, any entities are trying, you know, because I know people that channel stuff and have done things and are shown stuff by certain beings, and they're shown whole passages of past history and stuff like that. Well, that can be very easily manipulated, because how the astral zone works and all these parallel universes and things like that, they can create all sorts of scenarios and replay a whole scenario as the actual scenario was, but making alterations to it. So the only way that you can basically regress and find out things in the past for yourself is literally through your own body biocells, you know, the memory that's contained in your own genetics, okay? You can't trust anything outside yourself, you know, to being shown in that sort of sense, because the thing is about all these astral entities is that, yeah, at times you'll find some incredible truths from them, but it's always infected with a certain agenda distortion, okay? Because they always want to use you for a certain purpose. And yeah, they will teach you amazing tricks and abilities to gain your trust and to do certain things. and even some really good things. But at the end of the day, you've got to be able to see the forest from the trees as to what the strategy of their agenda is, because at the end of the day, they are feeding off your life force energy, okay? And for them to exist and to have their extended light creation reality, they need you to get you to project your organic energy that you've got in your body, okay? And that also you can use as a conduit to get earth energy through your body as well, you know, say through a lot of, you know, certain chanting and stuff that happens in certain spiritual modalities like Buddhism, Hinduism and all that sort of thing. Because what that actually does is actually get your voice to open up certain things, certain frequencies, to then actually use your body as a conduit to actually get up earth energy. And then with your voice, this is another thing where we've been genetically sort of hacked as well, to actually project all that energy towards the astral. So basically their whole astral energy system gets refed all the time. Okay? And that's why they're happy to teach you a lot of good things as well and give you good energy like Reiki energy and all that sort of things from the master symbols that the Dracos control outside of yourself. But you should be using your own Reiki energy from your own inherent center, which is connection to creation force energy, okay? And yeah, and they will give you a lot of good energy and heal people and stuff like that. And, you know, if you do yoga and Tai Chi and all that sort of thing, yeah, it does keep your body in very good condition and allows you to live for longer. But the problem is the way it's all designed, it gets you to invest all your energy into their sort of second-hand energy grid, so to speak. Okay? They're basically the ferryman. They're sort of being the middleman in the deal, you know? It's sort of like, yeah, we'll give you all this energy and stuff like that, but, you know, you have to be hooked into our matrix. And it's like in the Matrix movie. It's sort of like there's one point where you just kind of tell it that unless you're unplugged, anyone who is still plugged into the matrix is a potential agent. Now, that literally refers to like when you're astral tagged and you're hooked in with all of these things, like they want you to be hooked into their astral grid. That's the whole thing. That's what that's all about. And when they say, oh, yeah, someone that's still plugged in is a potential agent, well, that's when the upper hierarchy can move through those lower entities and use anyone that's astral tagged and basically get them to do unconscious behaviours against anyone that's a problem for them. And many times, all of these people around me, including my flatmate, sometimes would do diabolical mistakes and things to me, and I'd go, what the fuck were you doing that to me the other day? Why did you just go and, you said you were going to go and clean up the house and you ended up throwing out my most important things? You know, just simple things like that, just to make your life more haphazard and full of chaos. And literally, for a good 2 years of that almost 5-year period from 2010 to 2014, my life was inundated with events like that, with coincidences and things like that, where people close to me, people I trust and all that sort of thing, are doing strange behaviours and making my life even more difficult and stressful. And then I'd point out all this stuff and they'd be hugely apologetic and everything, and they'd do things to make it up for me. But now I realise that in the first place, they didn't mean to do it in the first place. But when you're astral tagged, those astral tags will fool you into doing behaviours, and afterwards you'll think to yourself, now why the fuck did I just do that for? That's not me. And until people realise, unless you're 100% conscious of who you are and your actions, these astral entities are very clever into working out what you like and what you don't like and all that sort of thing, and getting you to do excessive behaviours, okay, that go beyond the normal point of what you would do that behaviour, okay, whether it's you like sugar or you like sex or you like, you know, alcohol or you like tobacco or you like doing this or you like doing that. Like, sure, anything is okay, you know, in moderation. It depends from person to person. Everyone's different. But when you do anything to an excessive sort of behaviour that turns into an addiction, and you're thinking, hold it, I was never like this, that's when you've got to start looking at the fact. Is there some, do I have a sort of a stowaway passenger on board here in my biofield that's basically, you know, I've got a hanger on, I've got a parasite onto me that's actually influencing my behaviours. Because the thing is about these astral entities is that they feed off your energy. They feed off all your sensual energy too, off all your senses, whether it's all your pain or your joy or your frustration or your happiness. And what they want you to do is to engage in actions that does that to excess, so they get a good juicy feed off all of that energy that you generate from doing that. And especially when a lot of emotional energy is invested into doing certain activities. So this is what the astral tags will do. So when I say to people how to work out whether you've got a tag or not, well, how well do you know yourself? Have you ever looked at, you know, knowing yourself and what are your habits and being that honest with yourself to going to what you like? Well, when you start to realise, well, okay, when you reflect and you go, well, up until this point in my life, I seemed okay, this was me, but then from this point onwards, I started doing this more, I started doing that more, started doing that more. So you've got to say to yourself, why? Why did I start doing that? You've literally got to go through your own emotional IQ, you've got to explore your own feelings and go, well, why did I do that? That doesn't make sense. So that's when you start to have an idea of when you got an unwelcome passenger, you know, astral parasite hanging off you. Okay, so I just thought I'd add that one there, okay, because this is what you've got to do. And generally speaking, it's the same thing if you've got a friend or anything else that you know is astral tagged. Sometimes just telling them straight out is not the best thing, because then they go through, you know, usually a bit of an ego thing or something like that, saying, what are you talking about? You know, they get offended, this, that, the other, especially if they're not open to it, you know. And then they've got to go through their whole process of this true, that, and then they might be in denial of it, thinking, nah, it's not possible. You know, that's all balderdash. That's all crap, you know. They don't teach that in school or anything. That's all just hocus pocus, you know. But it's very, very real. And unfortunately, all of our system science and medicine was created by these occultists that deal in all these sort of things, these sorcerers, so that basically we have a very limited understanding of the metaphysical, and in particular the activities that these people get up to. Okay, so that's just another point for consideration when you're looking at, if you think you always need system science, physical evidence, you know, for everything, you know, for proof in this reality. Sure, it helps, but let's face it, this whole reality is not a physical existence, and you need to map the consciousness of the unconscious metaphysical realm until you start getting an idea of more of the whole reality. And unfortunately, we've been blocked from this, you know, by the whole Western education system. This is just another thing that's there to keep us stupid. Where if you grow up in an indigenous tribe somewhere, I even hate using that word indigenous because it's another derogatory word, the same as native, but just using it for the sake of being able to communicate effectively here. But I just like to, you know, draw that point out as well. And if you grow up in a tribal thing away from Western civilization, well, you learn about all this stuff and nothing's hidden from you. All the processes of life, nothing's kept from you as a child. Everyone basically experiences everything together, from the very youngest to the very oldest, and nothing's hidden, okay? Unlike repressed sort of Western civilization, for the most part. I should say Western mechanized civilization. So, okay, where was I at this point of the story? So you're asking me...
Well, basically, you were saying about, wasn't you, at the beginning of why you was ill and all the shape-shifting and that was doing that to stop you from revealing the truths when you was a child. I mean, to be honest with you now, we've got about probably 10 minutes left when I can put this onto Blog Talk Radio. So if you could try and summarise a bit more at the end of it, if you can. If you can't, then we can always stop and I can add another recording on. I'll leave that to you. All right?
Yeah, we'll probably need another recording because I'm about to hit the juice. Now the thing is that as a result of that, my mother kept on taking me back to the house, and I became a major subject of interest regarding all of these unreported medical experiments that also had occult applications. And they would load me up with all sorts of these substances, you know, and sometimes I'd remote views, sometimes I could hear echoes of eyes wide shut, like sort of parties in the house, okay? Because especially when you're a child and you have some sort of psychic intuitive ability, this only just heightened those things in me. And so he used to test a lot of substances on me. And for some reason, I remember this one clear moment when I was on the bed one time, and I was in this really, really drugged out state. I was as high as a kite. I was lying on the bed, and then he said to me, and my mother was behind him, he said to me, why is it that when basically I inject everyone else, with these substances and stuff like that, everyone else falls asleep and becomes paralyzed, becomes paralyzed and falls asleep. But he says, but when I do you, because many times he'd sort of load me up full of whatever drugs, and he'd put me on the bed, and then when he'd come back, not only had I not been knocked out, but I had moved off the bed and I was trying to hide in the room somewhere so they couldn't find me. And he found that astonishing, considering that everyone else that he tested would just get paralysed or knocked out. And he said to me on the bed this time, why is it that you remain awake and conscious and you can even move, yet no one else does? And I literally said straight back to him, I remember in this out of it state, but I was in the part of myself that's me, my centre, deep within inside myself. And I realised even back then, I somehow unconsciously, automatically knew how to tap into the part of me that no one could take me away from me, if you know what I'm saying. And I said straight back to him, and I said, that's because most people, when they're awake, are actually still asleep. I kid you not. 4 years old, I said that straight back to him. You should have seen the look on my mother's face. And my mother was getting very uncomfortable because what happened after this initial experience, okay, when he first sort of indoctrinated me to this. Now, the sneaky bugger, it wasn't so little. The fact that he pointed that time when I went, where's Mum? He pointed inside the room to the study and all that sort of thing. It's almost like he knew. He already wanted to experiment on me. And the thing is that I already know. Okay, I've probed this deep and hard, and I've gone through a lot of deep investigation, of which I can't go into everything of how I do all the investigation. But I do find out a lot of information from my centre. And that is a subject for another show, okay? And how I do that, because that's something that I've been mapping very hard. And once I'd learned how to do that and activate that about 6 months ago when I reversed all this shape-shifting and twisting. Okay? I'll get back to that. Now, he treated me in a way, after that, like an adult. He gave me full roam of the house. He let me be curious, look around things, ask questions. And he wanted to get as much data out of me as possible. He found me a particularly interesting sort of subject. But the thing is that I know, see, with these scientist types and professors, okay, these guys would have been associated with Tavistock and real deep, dark ops sort of stuff. But before even those guys are just carrying out the work for the high priest sorcerers who really are at the top of the Illuminati shit pile, okay? In the sense of they're the ones that hold all the knowledge, okay? It's the occult sorcerers are the ones who are basically directing the show as into getting certain things done for the sake of all the Dracos, okay? This is where it goes to a whole new level, because the Dracos have an agenda and they want to achieve certain things. And how they control the humans is on a compartmentalised level. So none of them, it's the same with all the masonry and stuff like that. They're all on a need-to-know level, need-to-know basis for the level that they're on of the operation. and they're not told anything further, above that, okay? And that's, if you watch Project Camelot enough times, there's enough interviews with people where they go into all of that, okay? And that's well explained. That part, they're very accurate in telling about that, because if you want to basically have an operational base, it's like how the army works. It's like you obey orders and you don't question your senior. So that way, if anyone tries to piece together, see the whole forest from the trees, they can't, because they're only given compartmentalised information that's specific to their job for that part of the operation. So when you even look at these professors and doctors and stuff like that, and even my mum that was sort of involved with all these people, although they are on a much higher level than most other people of knowledge, they still don't know the whole equation. But this professor had obviously been told to basically, especially after I'd been, well, this was before I was experimented on too. He'd obviously been told to make sure you have a look at that doctor's child, okay? And I'll tell you why once I sort of reveal my mother's bloodlines, which was a huge shock to me, okay? That I never really had any idea of until I found it all out. And so this professor, the fact that he pointed to where my mum was, and he would have well known my mum. Look, I know that my mum earlier, before she was basically injecting stuff into the back of this guy's head, mate, she was basically having it off with this guy all afternoon, and that's why she was taking so long, okay? I'll just cut to the short there, At that stage of her life, yeah, she was basically having the odd fling with the odd doctor or scientist and stuff like that. And my dad was never one the wiser. And I know it's not a savoury thing to talk about, but it just is what it is. And the thing is that professor would have known that it would have caused a flap by basically me walking in. So hence, in my mum's eyes, he was justified in injecting me because I walked in at the time when basically she was injecting something into the back of that other guy's neck. Now, lo and behold, when I regressed this incident and I saw this guy's face, I then went, no way. Because it was actually the guy it actually validated my flatmate's story, because it was literally almost exactly the same face as my flatmate. And I put two and two together very, very quickly, and I went, my goodness. Not only does my flatmate's crazy story checks out, but he was actually, in all the places he was working and stuff like that, well, he was in there working with my mother and had a fling with my mother.
Wow.
Yeah. While he was basically put into that body, into that life, before he actually ended up having a car crash in the mid-80s, and he got returned to his body in this current life and timeline.
Incredible.
And the thing about this guy that makes his story so believable is that he has so much memory recall of what happened in that. And not only that, this guy knows so much deep information that for a good deep researcher, he actually fills in all the holes that only possibly an insider could know, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And look, when you're watching music videos, cartoons on TV, lots of programs, he completely deconstructs all the programming behind everything. And he just hits the nail on the head. And so this is the thing. So, I give him credit, even though he's an arsehole for pissing off on me sort of back in October last year, and leaving me with a large electricity bill and leaving this place in a pigsty and all that thing like that. I give credit due where. At the end of the day, he was astral tagged and he'd made knowledge contracts with astral entities. That's the price you pay. And I'd obviously gotten that close to something that they basically told him to get the fuck out of here, and to basically cut ties with me, the whole everything, because I was getting too close to a lot of stuff, and I was working out a lot of stuff I wasn't meant to work out. And that's what happened with every single one of these people around me that was tagged. that eventually I'd worked out stuff, and instead of the astral hierarchy using them against me, I turned the tables and used them against them, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I started to piece this all together and work out how I was being played by the same entities through all these other lower astral entities to basically manipulate me from all sorts of angles and keep me in a place of stress and keep me off track, you know, and sort of chasing my tail. But I kind of worked to my own, like as I said earlier, I just observed everything and I pieced it all together. I followed my own path and nose with all of this, and this is what I basically came to. And I started working out things and getting these people to actually help me find out what I needed to find out. And I kind of cross-referenced all of these people against information that they were given from certain astral entities and stuff like that. And then I'd find out all the consistencies and where all the stories and the holes would be. And I used to corner all of them and saying, well, hold it, you were saying this, 6 months ago, and now your source is saying completely the opposite, like now. What's the story? And I've amazing memory for significant sort of points like that. And so that's where I get them all. And so basically, so that's what happened with him. And then we get to the incident, okay? I became a certain subject of interest. So as I just said to sum up there, the professor obviously used that as a great opportunity, as an excuse to inject me, okay?
Yep.
And it would justify okay to my mum because I'd walked in on, her injecting this guy in the back of the head, and I'm not meant to be pricked to any of that stuff. So he used that as an excuse to sort of get in. So he was obviously a very clever professor, and he worked that opportunity. But he had obviously been nudged from someone. Oh, if you get the opportunity, see if you can basically, use the doctor's young child as a test experiment, because they were very interested in my genetics, okay, as I found out later. And it also proved to them that I had very strong genetics, because I wouldn't be knocked out by all these substances. Now, some of these substances, they would literally, what I worked out was that they were using all of those giant reptile frogs and alien-looking sort of reptilian sort of, creatures and exotic-looking sort of lizards from all around the world. Well, what they do is they basically get all the fluid from all their glands, okay? And they mix those substances with other certain anesthetics and other sort of substances. And it's like taking an LSD trip or some sort of drug, that puts you in a very high sort of state, intuitive state, okay? Psychic state, extended psychic state is the best way that I could describe it, because there was many different sort of drug highs I experienced. But not only that, some of the drugs they injected into me were highly toxic things. And it was actually what created, with all these full-on highly toxic mycoplasmas in my system, it's what enabled me to get glandular fever, chronic fatigue syndrome, and a generic hepatitis that came with it for a whole year in 1986. And if I hadn't have been injected with all that crap when I was younger, I wouldn't have been so susceptible to picking it up.
Right.
Okay? So there's all sorts of things that I've worked out and complications that all make sense now in my life that's as a result of what happened during this sort of 3 to 4 year period. Now, the incident that caused the shape-shifting, okay, what happened here was that he then took me downstairs. Now, when he first injected me in the neck, by the way, that was literally on September 11, 1972. Okay? Bit of a heavy ritual day coincidence.
Yep.
And then in the next 10 days, my mum kept on bringing me back there, and he did more experimentations, as I kind of just described then. But then he took me downstairs for about 3 days in a row. and he drugged me up on lizard juice and whatever else he was putting in there.
Yep.
And he'd lie me down on this kind of like rug carpet, and he put me in front of this statue with the creepy looking eyes. And I used to hate it. I hated it. And he'd do that, and I remember he kind of turned the light out in the room, so the light, there was only limited light in the room. It was either coming from outside or a lamp or something like that. And he did this day after day. And I remember I kind of went, why is he doing this? Why is he putting me in front of this scary looking bloody statue all the time? And I could sense there was something really creepy about the statue. I could just sense it in my bones. Like it was like that there was something in it, or there was something attached to it. Even though as a kid at 4 years old, you got no idea of how to sort of express or say that. But I just felt there was just something wrong about it. And then literally on this one day, and this was on September 22, another ritual day, by the way.
Right.
Heavy ritual day in the pagan calendar, as far as the elites are concerned. I'm looking at this statue, and he's always telling me to focus on the eyes. And that's the last thing I wanted to do, was to focus on the eyes. But he was always telling me to focus on the eyes. And then this one day, I was in total sync. I was in a deep trance looking at this thing. And then, I kid you not, this being just popped out of the statue and just went thump on the ground with its feet.
Wow.
Yep. And it had sort of what I would say would be dark skin, more bordering on black skin rather than brown skin. And it was a humanoid-looking creature that was kind of like human and something else. It just looked... it didn't look, it looked like something out of Hollywood, so to speak. Okay? And then this thing, it jumped out of the statue, and then I started carrying on like a pork chop and basically saying, "Did you see that? Did you see that? Did you see that?" And there's a bit of a pandemonium in the room. And then this thing ran out of the room and into the hallway, and then within 10 seconds you heard this loud, ghastly shriek and scream from the maid of the house, like she'd literally seen the devil.
Wow. So this actual thing that it was on a physical, it did manifest into a 3D reality, not just in your perception then, obviously, if they made it to see it as well.
Well, the fact that it actually went thump on the floor, I'll never forget that thump of its feet hitting the floor.
Wow.
Yeah. And then the fact that it went out into the hallway and scared the bejesus out of the poor maid of the house, she like screamed like she was being murdered or something, okay?
Well, you would do, wouldn't you, seeing that? Wow. Definitely.
Yeah, like literally in her perspective, she's probably a good little Christian girl and she'd probably seen the devil, It's like...
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like... And then after that, I could see... I remember looking over on the rug and sort of moving to the side so I could see through the doorway. And then I saw it ran up the stairs into the house.
Wow.
And this even freaked out the professor to such a point. And I kept on going, and everyone knew that this had happened, that stuff had gone down. And the professor... For the first time, I saw a concerned look on his face, and the whole time I'd known him there. And then he went and got the statue and took it out of the room and put it into some room in storage somewhere in the house or something like that. Now, what that being was, I know now, that jumped out of the statue, that was a Draco.
Amazing.
Yep. And the thing is that it had been locked in that statue Okay, this is where it gets crazy, but I'm just going to jump straight to it because we don't have much time at the moment.
Go for it, yeah.
But that Draco had been locked up in that statue for thousands of years. Now, initially when I regressed all of this, I didn't look too much further into the statue until just recently, actually, because I was more concerned with finding out other details, concerning with my mum and thinking how's she involved with this mob of people, because my mum did go to the Royal College of Medicine in London in the late 50s, because she'd made a significant Tesla-like medical sort of discovery in 1954, which was in 6-year medicine. And so she was fully groomed by the Masons, and then I was chasing all that down, and then I realised that my father was a Mason, and lo and behold, for fuck's sake, he's actually like a Masano Jew. Like, the name is Newman, the surname. But then I realised I did a lot of research and fishing around and using my centre and, a combination of, standard research things and also, using my own energetic sort of abilities. Just everything combined, like as I'm saying, it's like using all your senses spontaneously and simultaneously in the present moment. So we've got a lot of energetic resources in our body to basically use that for most people they're just dormant all their lives because we're told that our body is just a biological function that supports the brain and the heart. So I know that's not the truth. The best example of someone who was a sentient person was Bruce Lee. He learned how to use his body. He learned all that mind discipline stuff from the Shaolin and the martial arts, but he took it to a much simpler and more powerful level by learning how to use the body as one. To use it as a whole intelligence, to observe it, to map it. And in my opinion, that's the real reason. Not only, sure, he was giving away deep secrets from high initiate places in sort of Buddhist circles and, all the Shaolin stuff, but really what he did that would have pissed him off even more was the fact that he'd worked out how to centre, and he was making this very easily accessible for anyone to do in a much simpler way. And this is the whole point about centering. It's like you don't have to spend all your life in a bloody monastery or anything like that, meditating and the whole everything to get all these mind disciplines. Sure, it's amazing what these people could do, but you can actually get there much quicker and simpler by using all of yourself instead of, okay, now I'm going to sort of connect my third eye with my heart chakra and balance that and find what's going on. Now I'm going to connect it with my gut. Now I'm going to connect it with my base and then do this one with that one. And that's too complex. That's too, this whole multi-dimensional thing. The thing is that when you, and it's accessing it by, with its dimensional or density or whatever, it's like you have to go through this graduated level through the astral of all the, 9 different levels and the whole everything, and you've got to go through initiation, and people down the bottom can't know what people up the top is. And as far as I'm concerned, the lack of transparency involved just tells you, well, there mustn't be anything, it mustn't be good by the time you get to the top, because if it's really good, it should be transparent right through down the way. And that's the whole thing about centering. You access all dimensions of reality at once, and you don't need to even consciously in your mind know what you're doing at that time. You're just accessing all of it, and you just go straight to everything that you need as you need it. It's like intellectualism is only, it's a waste of time unless it's poignant to the isness of the moment. It's like knowing, what's the point of knowing a whole library of information if you can't make what you need in the present moment, that right bit of intellectual knowledge, if you can't make that poignant to the isness of that moment and it's actually useful for it, what's the point of knowing all that knowledge when you never get to use it in the present moment of now?
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
Yeah, by all means, it's good to have knowledge, but this is the thing, and this is the whole problem with the intellectual realm, and the whole snobby thing and the meritocracy that goes along with that in our current world, is that it's all third-party information that's taught to us, and unless we actually learn what it is, it's just terminalised fiction. It's a language outside of ourselves that's a non-sensory language that we can't access with our senses, okay? And that's how they control us, by having this intellectual sort of third-party sort of bankrupt sort of knowledge that's not even your own knowledge, that's sensed with your own experience. And you got to, by all means, it's good to have some intellectual knowledge out there as a knowledge base. But the thing is that we should be taught how to, go inside ourselves to the places where we already know everything. That once we hit those places, we just do it ourselves, and then using that first party experience, in conjunction with all the vicarious, analysis of third party information. We've got to combine everything, because I'm not going to say the mind's a useless thing, but if you control your reality just with your mind, well, the mind's been hacked as well, and that's a whole dualistic sort of construct that's been put there with ego. Okay, so if you try and work out anything with your mind and try and find out the secrets of the universe and creation and do it just with your mind, well, you're just going to be bouncing from one side of the duality to the other. It's just a whole labyrinth of mirrors, and you're just going to drive yourself crazy. And that's why psychiatrists say, "Oh, don't go inwards, you go crazy." But that's garbage. You've got to go inwards. But the whole thing is that you've got to access the whole of yourself, not just your brain. That's the fundamental difference here. Okay, yeah. So what happened was when I activated this Draco to come out of this statue, there was obviously something in my genetics, in my past lives, in who I was, however you want to look at it in that sort of regard, that had some connection to this thing that was able to activate it to come out of it. Now, what I've learnt was that when the elites used Hitler and the whole fascist experiment, okay, in World War II, they got Hitler and the Nazis to basically explore the whole world, to look through everything, every culture, every tradition, every bit of occult, every bit of sorcery, no matter whether it's voodoo or this, that, the other. The whole sort of thing, like as I heard Joseph Farrell once say on an interview, very correctly, and just have it in a nutshell, is just about get the information, explore everything that you needed to do without any limits, and then once they had the information, piss off all the spirituality and let's get into the hard nuts and bolts and make technology with it, okay? He said something along those sorts of lines. Anyway, that's what I've sort of worked out myself anyway. And that's what they did with Hitler. And one thing with Hitler, he was obsessed with all the Egyptian stuff and all the underworld stuff and the African stuff. And because the whole thing is that there were two Homo sapiens seedings, and the second Homo sapiens seedings, okay, were made by Dracos. The first Homo sapiens seedings were made by Enki with the assistance of Ishtar, and they were pure Anunnaki, okay? And Dracos are a sort of a hybrid between pure reptilian races and Anunnaki, okay? But I'll go into that another time. But for the point here is that they're always telling us that, the Africans are the first humans. I think I might have said it earlier in the interview, but they're not. They were only the first of the second Homo sapien seedings. And the second Homo sapiens seedings were about 50,000 years ago after the flood. Okay? Just so that we can get a time perspective here. And this statue was used as a tool. Okay? I thought this statue was just basically like a burial chamber or a treasure chamber guardian, and that I'd basically invoke the curse of the mummy, so to speak, or the curse of the statue in this case. But it went much deeper than that. This statue was thousands of years old, and this statue had actually come out of the chief sorcerers, and what Hitler was doing was he'd gone all around the world looking for underworld keys of Solomon, things like that. But what the elites found out of that whole thing is that you can't find the codes and the keys in sort of physical objects that are inanimate. It's like the codes are connected within certain people's genetics, and those codes are only accessible when they're living. Okay? And it gives you an idea of why royals are initially royals, because they were actually made with genetics to be used as an interface, as conduits, say for instance using with the pyramid technology, with all the crystal technology back in Atlantean times, when they're basically harnessing all the Earth's energy as a battery to use for all sorts of things, for you know, getting inside the primary forces. They'd use sort of rituals, sexual rituals and that sort of thing with these humans with certain genetics to be able to do these things. And usually these humans with the genetics were all these royal lines that were all manipulated genetics for these purposes to be used, because let's face it, the human body is almost the best technology in the universe. If not, it's the best technology. And so we're not taught about how the human body can actually be used in an energetic sense as a conduit interface between, you know, in other certain energetic sort of purposes, like whether you're making, you know, you're using, because the pyramid was a microchipping of the Earth's chakras, energy centers, okay? And they'd use the humans to then basically either create lasers to destroy something, okay, or to basically manipulate the weather, get inside the primary elements, etc., etc., etc. There was countless uses. And so just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from when I'm talking about underworld codes and genetics and things like that. And there was obviously something with my genetics that activated in that sort of drugged out state on lizard juice and all the rest of it, that activated this Draco to come out of this statue. Now, by activating it to come out of this statue, I'd actually broken a spell because it had been locked in that statue 30,000 years ago, and apparently I was the person that did it. It was my genetics, my whole thing. And I know this sounds pretty crazy, but I will get into that on another occasion. But I'll just put it out there for now. Yeah, it'll be controversial, whatever, you know. I don't really mind because...
Well, I know for me, Goz, it makes sense. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all eternal beings that have been around forever. We've never been created. So what's stopping you being this being that put the Draco in there in the first place? So just going back to that then, with the Draco in the actual statue, do you think you put that there then as you was like playing the good guy in that lifetime, let's say, and you imprisoned it, this Draco? Do you ever find out why you imprisoned it or not?
Yeah, I did imprison it because I found out. I only just worked out in the last week.
Wow.
Who this actual Draco was, and it's been staring at me in the face the whole time, because the main Draco entity that was working through all these astral tag people around me, trying to get at me, and it was actually this Draco followed me around all my life, trying to astral tag me, looking for an opening point, and only found that opening point when I was in a deep depressed state after I'd been sick for a year with glandular fever, okay, chronic fatigue syndrome. And so it astral tagged me when I was 19. And then I got another astral tag at 29, and as I said, at 35 I got them both removed. And since I got them removed by that originally shaman, it's been looking at a way to get back at me ever since. It's been following me around, it's been doing everything. And one day I actually had an interface with this Draco entity through this woman who was doing the healing for me, you know, who's over your way.
Yeah.
And she basically operated as the go-between, and I was having a bit of a conversation because I was calling out all this stuff that was happening, you know. I was calling out the fact that Tavistock and CERN basically had a big mainframe computer with computer programs that were creating all these fake astral entities, okay? So this is the thing that we're dealing with. Not only are we dealing with standard astral entities and Dracos and stuff like that, but there's a whole heap of fake ones as well.
Wow. That
are computer generated.
Unbelievable.
Because there was quite a few weeks back, it was in November last year, December, I called out Ashiana Dean's Guardians as fake entities generated by CERN. And that caused a bit of hoo and ha and all that sort of thing. But then, because I'd already outed Colontic science on all the language stuff a couple of years ago, and I wrote some posts about that, I'll actually show you. And then what I realised was, well, not so much what I realised. Now, only just in the last couple of weeks, some other people are coming out with information now that CERN actually has 600 belief system programs. I rest my case.
Wow.
Now, I worked that out, plus a lot of other things, by asking my centre. Who's your centre? They say the all-seeing eye, you know, the eye on top of the Illuminati pyramid. Well, that's the eye of Enlil, okay? I don't know if many people know that. Okay, he's the god of, he's the god of the Bible, okay? And the thing is that becomes an all-seeing eye, because if you're at the top of the astral hierarchy, as in the Matrix movie, if you're plugged in, you become a potential agent, and that astral hierarchy can work through anyone that's plugged in. So that's why it becomes the all-seeing eye. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's perfect sense, yeah.
But when you connect into your center, okay, you have the ability to find out anything on any level. Okay? It goes well beyond the all-seeing eye. Well beyond.
Yeah.
The thing is that this information about how to tap into your own center, your own, you know, using all of your intelligence, body intelligence all at once. Well, these Dracos have see, this is the biggest secret that they've kept from humanity, from freedom within and finding their own self-empowerment. Because as soon as you find your own center, you become fully accountable and responsible for yourself. And not only that, you become independent. You don't need a system of externalized information, you know, in order to find your salvation and your way through life. You know, you can rely on yourself. So when you have self-belief, well, that's your connection in your inherent center, which is actually the child of its parents, okay? And that child's always connected to its parents, and that parents being the organic internal creation source itself.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's the thing. When you connect to your center and your whole body in that sense, it is connected to source all the time. Now, the organic internal creation source comes before this light creation stuff, okay? And this light creation stuff is all controlled by the astral and all the Dracos in there. Now, take me a little bit of time to explain all the mechanics on that, but that's the thing. Organic internal creation source comes before light creation, and a great example is when you look at orgone energy discovered by William Reich. Well, that orgone energy is that organic internal creation source energy, or what scientists term as the quarks in quantum reality. Well, you know, they got all that silly terminology for that. And the thing is about, like, the light creation energy is all electromagnetic energy, okay?
Yep.
And when Einstein came up with his E equals mc squared, well, he was right about that, but that only applies to electromagnetic energy. It doesn't apply to orgone energy or anything else, okay? And they want us to keep on using electromagnetic energy, okay? It's like the dirty electricity, okay?
Yep.
It's constantly feeding their astral energy grids, okay? It's constantly getting you to invest your organic energy that you have in your human body, okay? The human body has 33% organic source creation energy in it, okay? Well, your pineal gland only, and Lily talks about this information really well. She just describes the breakdown of this stuff brilliantly.
Yeah, I've seen the videos. They're very, very good. Yeah.
And here she talks about how the pineal has only got 3.3% organic energy, where the rest is all inorganic light creation energy, okay? And duality was only created on this planet from Sumerian times, where the Sumerian Magyar affinity was completely hijacked by the Maldek Draco-created humans, the Hyksos Khazars, and the Hibaru Hebrews. And the thing is that the genetics were a lot different from the second seeding Draco-created human Homo sapiens. And I'm pretty sure that basically Enlil wanted to basically deal, you know, get his second seeding of Homo sapiens, okay, to basically conquer outdo the first seeding Enki ones. But as the old nursery rhyme goes, all of the king's horses and all of king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again. Now, what that really means is all of Enlil's horses and all of Enlil's men couldn't put Humpty, being Enki and Ishtar's egg, like the first Homo sapien, okay, back together again. He tried to copy it, but he couldn't copy it exactly, okay? The first Homo sapien seedings were created for the purpose of organic regeneration, okay? Where the Draco Homo sapien seedings were created to be servile to the Dracos and energy harvesting and all the rest of it, okay? So completely different sort of consciousness of intent here. But the thing is that a lot of these Draco second Homo sapien seedings ended up being really good people. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how you're created or anything like that. It comes down to who you are as a person. So just, because when it comes down to this, there's some Dracos over there and over history as well that have actually been some good guys that have been for organic regeneration and decided the path of separation and ending up as space dust through the inorganic sort of extended light creation sort of construct. They realised that it's not the way to go, because once you end up as space dust and completely fragmented, you end up in a space of nothingness before you even return to source again, and you basically have to go through the whole conscious experience of being in separation again, physical separation. But the whole thing is to be conscious of the creation source of which you're part of, while you're consciously living in this separation. And that's what organic regeneration is about. It's really quite simple. It really is quite simple. And the thing is that all of these sort of reptilian and Anunnaki sort of dog and bird race types, and even some Anunnaki, were human looking, The whole thing is that this is what the human form was required for all these different races to do the organic regeneration, because a lot of them had become so addicted to the physical separation and stuff like that they'd basically fallen away. They'd become detached from source. They'd become not conscious of the creation source while they were living in separation. So they weren't integrated while they're in separation. And so eventually you become detached from the creation source, and then you get these types that want to be detached from the creation source because they want to create their own reality, their own fiction construct that, superimposes or juxtaposes over the real reality. But the problem is eventually that if you end up doing that to all life, okay, you detach yourself from the creation, still have to get that creation source energy to keep your extended light creation going, your own fictional construct. So you still have to parasite and pimp the energy of all living things in order to do that. And that's the reason why the Dracos do what they do, why they do the soul harvesting of humans to get the organic energy out of humans. And they used to do it directly to the Earth frequency before the Earth tilted itself and stopped them from doing that when they were trying to do more shenanigans. And when they reverse polarized the cyclical timelines they created that started in Sumerian times, where they hijacked the whole Sumerian Magyar affinity and turned all of the organic internal creation source identification symbols of whole nature processes, but that are externalized, okay? They turned all of that, they split them into duality separation, making them positive, negative, masculine, female, and light and dark. And basically when they created that duality, that's what created spells, and all the rest of it. And that happened when the Maldek Draco created humans hijacked, all of that, because the Maldek Draco humans were far more advanced in their genetics than the human created ones. And as I said before, able to sort of, subdue the first seeding Homo sapiens. And even the flood only wiped out 50% of the first Homo sapiens seedings. And even today, in the world, we've got a combination of 60% Draco-created second Homo sapiens seedings, doing a big mishmash with 40% of first Homo sapiens seedings. And we're talking about the Homo sapiens seedings well, into 100,000 years ago when that happened. Okay, but the thing is that all the reverse polarizations, the duality was introduced only 6,000 years ago in Sumerian times, once they hijacked it all of the Sumerian Magyars. And by the way, Magyars and Moors were of that first Homo sapiens seedings, and they were also, Magyars and Moors themselves even precede the Homo sapiens seedings. Magyars in particular in the Homo erectus, and the Moors go all the way back to when Olmecs were created by Anunnaki mixing with the Australian Aborigines who were Cro-Magnons at that stage, and they created Olmecs. Okay, that's a whole other discussion.
I think what we ought to do, excuse me, what we ought to do, Goz, is probably call it a day there because we're over 3 hours now. I'm just going to put this straight onto YouTube instead of blog.radio. And I think that what you're just talking about now, the last part, I think we ought to have a full show on that from what you know from start to finish to really get people's. I mean, because I understand exactly what you're talking about, because obviously I've done a lot of the research and the knowledge what you will know, but a lot of people haven't got a clue probably what we're talking about. So I think we need to do a full show on that and give them the knowledge. Yeah, are you up for that?
Yeah. Well, I tried to conduct this from a very simple beginning. I took a while to warm up in this interview and the background stuff, and you may want to edit some of that stuff. That's up to you, I guess.
No, I want to leave it on. I want to leave it on. No, yep. Leave it on. Yeah, it's fine.
So I guess you can't get it more candid than this. But did I mention to you what my mother's bloodlines were?
No. If you want to go into that in 5 more minutes, just go into that, and then we'll call it a day for this recording. Because I'd love to know. You've not told me this bit yourself, so I'd love to know it. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. Okay. I'll go into my mother's bloodlines because this is part of the reason why I have the genetic sort of stuff in me, let alone my father's bloodlines adding to that. I found out that my mother's real bloodlines, that she was actually one of these, as Greg Hallett talks about. I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
No, I'm not actually, no.
Well, Greg Hallett talks about how all the royal families of Europe are all second-string, illegitimate Rothschild silent bloodlines, secret bloodlines. And this is how the Rothschilds have basically built this network around the world, is that all the males in all their families, sure, they continue their own bloodlines and family to keep the wealth in, but then they basically go around creating all these bastard children, okay,
yep,
that become the Stalins, the Churchills, the Titos, all the Hitlers, okay,
yep,
that basically carry out all their operations, and they have whole bloodlines of assassins, of monarch slaves, of all sorts of reasons. And Greg Hallett does some incredible, he's one of the best researchers out there in my opinion, because his information is so deep and so true. He really knocks the nail on the head. And not only that, when a researcher can get inside the consciousness of these people and how they think and operate, that's when you really know your subject. When you can do the psychological profiling and you can understand, say for instance, the Draco consciousness, and what their strategies are, what makes them tick, and all that sort of thing, then you really get to understand and start to get on a level peg with these people that have always been so many steps ahead of us, okay? And then we can start to get steps ahead of them. And what I found out about my mother was that she was actually a silent Rothschild bloodline.
Wow. I sort of half expected that, but
yep.
That's quite a revelation. Yeah, awesome.
And that one gets really crazy because where that started, I was watching a Dr. Phil Valentine video, and he was doing an expose on Obama, and he's done some very, very good work on that actually. And he was basically talking about how Obama was basically a combination of Malcolm X and also this woman named Anne Dunham, or Durham. And he'd worked out that this Anne Dunham woman, her real name was actually Joan Newman. And this Joan Newman was connected with this other guy who was the mastermind in America of all the controlled oppositions and the created sort of black movement oppositions in America, especially during the 50s and 60s. And he was the one who masterminded the whole socialist takeover of America, okay? The whole communist thing, you know, because the New World Order sort of preferred sort of model is the whole sort of socialist communist sort of thing.
Yeah.
They've tried many, many different experiments, you know, from, you know, the National Socialism of the Germans, the Nazis sort of thing, to what happened in Russia, and, you know, even democracy is, you know, we think democracy in its essence is meant to be, you know, a true sort of, you know, thing of the people, but really, through the corporate organisation of democracy, it's really a crypto-plutocratic corporatocracy, isn't it?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It's not really a true democracy at all. And using this sort of Westminster system of parliament that's designed by Freemasons as well, and this whole two-party Labor, Liberal, Republican, Democrat thing, well, it's all a hoax, isn't it? Because if you back both horses, you're always going to win. And you just play one side against the other and towards the middle until you get the result that you want. And it may not even favour one side or the other side, you know, because that's what the hidden hand do in that sort of sense. You know, people can look that up in the whole Hegel sort of model of philosophy. And when I saw a picture of this Fred Newman, it was like when I saw a picture of my daughter for the first time in 7 years. She was taken away from me. That's another story. And I had this sort of barrister throw a picture of my daughter years later in a photograph in front of me when I was in a mediation session. And when I looked at that photo, like something jumped out of that photo, some genetic thing, and just hit me in the face so hard. And I had the same thing happen because I hadn't seen my daughter since she was 3, and she was sort of like 9, 10 at that stage. And when I saw this picture of Fred Newman, the same thing happened to me. And I saw my mother, I saw myself in this guy's face. And I went, and I just knew, deep in my centre, I knew right then, I went, no, it can't be. And the more I looked into it, and that just set off a whole set of dominoes in me working out the truth about my mother's bloodline. And not only that, this Fred Newman ended up being my mother's eldest half-brother. And then I realised that Joan Newman was actually the younger sister of my grandfather, Morris Newman. Okay?
Yeah.
So, g'day, Uncle Obama, if you're out there.
Oh wow, Goz, it's such an incredible story you've got. You really have, from start to finish. We could be talking on here for forever and a day, but unfortunately we can't. We'll have to give it come to a close now, and I think otherwise we'll be here until.
Sorry, there was just one other thing I said I was going to tie up. What was it? I'll go more into our next talk about the whole what I worked out in the whole bloodline thing.
Yeah.
But then there was one other thing I was just basically going to come back to and finish off. I think it might have been to do with, was it with the statue and that? Oh yeah, the name of the Draco. Yes.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Now, the name of this Draco that popped out was actually this Draco entity that had been basically trying to get to me and had actually tagged me from 19 to 30.
Yeah, you went through that when you was 19 and 30, 35?
And then,
29.
And then I said, through my English female friend, I had an interface with this one day when I was calling out all of this whole game that was being played against me, because I kind of knew they were trying to manipulate and using the kindness of my good friend to help me heal, but then they were astral attacking me and doing all sorts of nasty things to make me submit to basically, you know, being part of that whole thing, because I'm sure they had plans for me. But the thing is that they've never been able to control me all my life, hence I've been kept in the outer. Because what I've realised, that my whole family, the whole reason why I was all dysfunctional, such a mess growing up and everything, well, we were a Freemason-controlled family. You know, Freemasons were controlling our family from the shadows, setting off dominoes in the shadows you could never trace back to where they came from. And, yeah, it's really quite tragic, actually, what's happened there. And I'm the only one in the family that they couldn't make part of the club in that compartmentalised sort of need-to-know sort of way. Because even my mother and my brother, my father's dead now, and if only he was alive now and I could inform him of everything. But then again, he's still around at the moment and I have a way of contacting him, but I won't go into that now. But the thing is that I'm the only one they couldn't pull into line. I was too rebellious. I asked too many questions. I got into too much trouble growing up through my pursuit of trying to find out what is. And yeah, I've been many things to many people over the years. Some people will call me the devil. Some people will talk very highly esteemingly about me and everything in between. But what can you say? You know, it just is what it is.
Yep.
And until you have the full understanding of someone's path and journey, well, then you don't know what's going on. Anyway, this Draco that was basically, he was the same entity that was trying to get to me through all of these people. And when I was talking to him through this woman at this time, he was trying to make me submit, and I was calling him out and all of these other Tavistock and CERN sort of fake entities. Well, this is that you hear about in the Bible. And you'll even see on the internet, there's this great bit of, ex-white hats, disinfo out there. It's made to look very credible. And they're saying that basically, for years and years, there's been lots of rumours going around that Azazel's been released in a certain way. Some stories, he was released in the last 2 years, and no, he was released then, and this, that, and the other. And that basically Aleister Crowley had done rituals and used Duncan O'Finian, who's like a super soldier, to actually activate Azazel and bring him back. Because the thing is that Azazel was kind of like one of the head sort of Hathor Draco entities. And the Hathor Dracos are kind of like the pointy-headed deities that you see in all the Egyptian stuff, And some of them have got crocodile faces, and they're tall and they're slender and brown skin. Where the Shem Dracos are the ones that you see, say, like in Dragon Ball Z and stuff like that, when they're sort of having sort of intergalactic fights. And that's actually telling you the story of Maldek, actually, the war in Dragon Ball Z and stuff like that. And they're like your archetypical, like when you see pictures of Dracos, like the green skin ones or red and white Siakas, that sort of thing. And they generally have big noses, okay? And they're the ones with the horns. That was Akhenaton, who was Moses as well, okay?
Yeah.
Moses of the Bible is actually Akhenaton. And the ones that had the horns, well, that was a certain type of Shem Draco, okay? And the thing is that Archangel Michael is actually a Shem Draco. And so they needed their Hathor Draco back. Now, the Shem and the Hathor were fighting each other all through Atlantean times for control over Earth and humans. And the Shem Dracos were basically, they went and colonised Mars, and the Hathor went and colonised Maldek, and then the Shem event, and they were fighting with each other. There's this thing like known as the 100,000 Year War. It was mainly these two fighting each other, and they both suffered such heavy casualties and losses, they eventually had to come to a truce. Where in this day and age, they have more of like an organised sort of union together, because they've learnt from the past. But that's, to get into the factional politics of all that sort of thing, that's a thing for another day. So I actually activated Azazel, who was in this statue that I'd locked him up 30,000 years ago for reasons. I won't say who I was and why and all that sort of thing just yet, because that's a whole spiel in itself.
Yeah. Okay.
And these full-on sorcerer priests that go all the way up to Switzerland, okay, because that's where these Khazars, these ruling Khazars mainly are these days, because in Egyptian times they hijacked all the Egyptian pharaoh dynasty, and up until that stage they were mainly all Moorish and sort of Magyar. And Moors and Magyars were actually good allies back in the day, even though they were white and brown skin. There was none of that sort of racial sort of stuff going on between black and white that they ramp on about these days. And the Hebrews, well, they were kind of, they are like Shem Hathor Draco created humans because they're kind of in the image of them, because they're all brown skinned. And the Khazars themselves, that's where we get olive skinned people from, because the Khazars are not white people. They basically they've literally sort of fucked their way through every race of people. And so the Hyksos Khazars, basically in Egyptian times, they basically bred with the Magyars, and today are mainly known as the Swiss. But you get heaps of them in England, and there's other places as well. And the ones that basically mixed with the Moors are predominantly the Spanish today. Okay? And I can go through all these race lines and blood groups.
We'll have to do it another day, Goz. I'm sorry, mate. I've got to interrupt you because I've got to actually leave where I am at the moment. I've got no more time at all. That's why I've been trying to finish the interview for a bit. But I know the information is just that brill. I know. I just wanted to let you carry on. So I'd just like to say thank you so much for giving this massive story, because it's incredible, and I can't wait to edit it and get it out on YouTube and get some people to hear it. So I really do want to thank you from the bottom of my centre, I should say, not bottom of my heart. So thanks a lot for that, mate.
Well, you know what? Instead of what I say, I was thinking of that a few times too. It's like the best way, instead of saying bottom of your heart, just say bottom of your soul. Yeah. Because your whole soul is your centre. That's the whole thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks a lot from the bottom of my soul anyway, and no doubt we will do another one very shortly and carry on with the subjects we've touched on here. Okay?
And I hope I got all the right bits out there, and
you did.
I hope I haven't fallen over myself too much in describing some of it, because I've never done this before.
No, fantastic, mate. Brilliant.
I've never told my story, and there's some bits of controversial information I've given there, and a few sort of shocks to a few people, and...
Well, they need to know the truth, don't they? So that's how it is.
That's it. And look, this Azazel is so crafty that he even worked through. There's a Canadian woman out there.
I've got to go, mate. I've got to leave. I can't.
Okay,
I'm in an office basically, and I've got my time's up.
But this is the whole thing. He was that sneaky. He was that sneaky that he told another astral entity work that basically that I was literally like a Rothschild Rockefeller shapeshifter. Okay, and she's been trying to call me out as a New World Order sort of agent and the whole thing for ages. And this is how sneaky, these Dracos can be, and how they can play so many angles with so many people against you, and yet these people are given half-truths about people, but they don't know the other half of it. And look, I may be of these bloodlines and stuff like that, but I didn't know it for most of my life. And not only that, I've been cut off from my family. And as I'm talking to you right now, I don't even have sent to my name until Monday. So, until you know a person's situation. So I just thought I'd say that. And that woman is Dana Horachowski. And I hope you're listening, Dana, because, you're going to get a really rude shock. And your lesson is not to trust information that is astrally infected. Do not trust channeled information. If you're going to work out channeled information, you've got to find out a whole heap of information from a whole lot of different sources, and only then after you analyse it can you begin to put together some of the truth, if you're going to do it that way. Or you could just basically learn how to use your centre, and I'm going to be doing a video once because my body now has been healing from this shape-shifting thing for about 4 or 5 months now, and I've got another 3 or 4 months to go before my body comes back into place. So I'm spending every day healing my body at the moment, and it's pretty bloody weird having all your body move around like it is at the moment and come back into place, and with hips moving, pelvis moving, it's crazy. But hey, I'm not complaining. I'm still here, and we're moving right along. And I'm glad that I'm not turning into what they wanted to turn me into. But that was a massive payback. Oh, by the way, the last thing I forgot to mention, they took my sperm after all of this, and then they gave it to Mengele and started making super soldiers. Okay, I'll get on that one next time.
Yes, do that next time. I've got to go anyway, Goz, so it's been a pleasure doing this with you. So I'll speak to you soon.
Okay,
all right, mate.
Pleasure. Thank you, Alan.
Bye-bye.